Mike, he said he's going to be running a little bit late, but he'll be joining us shortly. So, all right. So it is August 29th, 2021, 5:07 p.m. I call this meeting of the Wellfleet Select Board to order in accordance with the temporary enhancement and suspension of certain elements of the open meeting law as allowed by the General Court of Massachusetts. And then the other boards are going to have to open their meetings as well.
Brian, that's September 29th.
Oh, September 29th. Sorry.
That's
What did I
okay.
say?
August.
Oh, I wish.
It's flying away. It's flying away, Brian, right?
So this is Kurt Felix, Chair of the Wastewater Committee, calling the meeting to order for the Wastewater Committee.
Janet, do you want to do Board of Health because Ken's not
Sure.
here?
This is Janet Drohan calling to order the meeting for the Board of Health.
Okay. So the first item on the agenda today is a presentation by the Wastewater Committee to the boards. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott and Kurt right now.
Thank you, Ryan. I want to, first of all, a couple of shout outs. Ryan, thank you very much for working so hard to finally pull together a meeting of the joint committees. I know this has been in the works for quite some time, and kudos for making it happen. We really appreciate it. I also wanted to, I know there are a couple of people here from DEP. We've got Patty Daly and I think Erin from the Cape Cod Commission. We have a number of other folks on the call. We certainly appreciate your time and your willingness to jump on this meeting today. I think just as a way of sort of a backdrop to why we're meeting and what we're trying to accomplish, obviously we'd love to have many more members of the public at these meetings to engage and hear the presentations and learn more about our wastewater planning. Our efforts have been going on for a little over 10 years now. And one thing that's been clear from town meeting after town meeting has been that the town meeting and general public have been very strongly supportive of the town of Wellfleet doing everything in its power to pursue alternatives to the greatest extent possible in our 208 compliance plan. We're at a crossroads where about a couple of years ago, DEP and EPA came to agreement on a 208 framework. Our consultant, Scott Horsley, was the consultant to develop the 208 plan for the Cape Cod Commission. So we are extremely grateful for his participation in helping the town of Wellfleet craft its plan. I think one of the other backdrops here right now is that the Conservation Law Foundation did recently file a lawsuit. And essentially not to get into the details of the lawsuit, but essentially the gist of it was their feeling is that if anybody that continues to put Title V systems in the ground is more or less in violation of the Clean Water Act. And so I think that's kind of interesting because clearly our efforts here are designed to ensure that Wellfleet takes a step forward such that that doesn't continue to happen and that we're certainly, I think, protecting ourselves from that type of litigation. I want to call out the DEP, and I can't thank the folks who have been working with us, both at the Cape Cod Commission and DEP, really as partners. Although you're our regulators, we had some meetings with, early on in the process where Millie kind of put Wellfleet, I guess, a little bit forward, I should say, with the idea that we could work together to develop alternatives and figure out the legal framework and the legal agreements that might be needed in a watershed permit that was involving a lot of alternatives. And the same is true of SRF. There's still some work to be done there to get the legal framework together such that if we apply for SRF funds, that there's actually a standing legal framework for that loan to be granted to the town of Wellfleet or to any other town for that matter. So Wellfleet is clearly blazing a trail here. I want to switch quickly over to just some comments that the Deputy Administrator of EPA provided at the One Cape Conference. Janet McCabe is the Deputy Administrator. She served in the Obama administration. She's had a stellar career in a variety of other capacities, which is, I'm sure, why Joe Biden chose her for this position. But let me just switch over briefly to her for about a minute and a half, because I think it's interesting in this context.
What you're doing.
Can you hear that?
So let me switch gears to water quality issues, an issue of great concern to everyone on Cape Cod. Rapid development on the Cape, often in or near environmentally sensitive locations, and relying primarily on septic systems to manage wastewater, is an issue that's led to increased nitrogen loading and habitat loss, leading to the impairment of embayments and ponds across the region. This is an issue that our Region 1 office in Boston is tracking very closely and is working with the Cape Cod Commission, towns across the Cape, to develop and introduce new solutions to address nutrients that rely on a combination of wastewater facility planning and use of new innovative nitrogen removing decentralized technologies. Expansion of sewering and development of new wastewater facilities will be an important part of the solution. President Biden is focused on helping communities with infrastructure needs like this, which I'll say more about in a minute. In many places, non-traditional technologies and new management approaches will also be needed, especially in places where traditional wastewater facilities are not cost effective. Suitable wastewater effluent discharge sites are not available, or land is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we know that many areas on Cape Cod have those characteristics. So EPA is encouraging communities to adopt both traditional and new technologies and approaches to solve their nutrient issues. Wellfleet is an example of a town that's seeking to use a combination of traditional and new technologies and approaches to implement the Cape 208 plan in their watershed. The town is discussing the incorporation of limited sewering and town-subsidized enhanced nitrogen-reducing septic systems, permeable reactive barriers, and aquaculture as part of their solution. EPA is working with partners across Cape Cod to evaluate the effectiveness of new emerging technologies that reduce nitrogen and provide other benefits. We're also helping municipalities understand the benefits and drawbacks of differing approaches and ways to reduce nutrient loading to surface waters more efficiently.
I'll just kind of stop it there. The purpose of our meeting today is really to kind of discuss the work to date that we've done and to look at the process going forward. I was very gratified to hear those comments from the Deputy Administrator, and I think it's a perfect framework for what's going on here on the Cape. And with that, Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kurt.
Scott, before you get started,
Sure.
one thing. So I discussed this with Scott beforehand. It's easier to take the questions as they happen in terms of the slides. So Scott, do you want me to see who has questions before proceeding, or will you do that?
Actually, I'd love you to let me know, Ryan, because I'm going to be paying attention to the presentation, not watching for hands and whatnot. So if you or Rebecca or anybody wants to prompt me as a question comes up, please do so, because I'm perfectly comfortable doing that. And we'll have maybe we can focus any questions along the way if they're specific to a slide that I have up, and maybe hold the more general questions till the end. That might make sense as a suggestion for me. That's okay with you?
Yep, that makes perfect sense to me.
Okay, well, let me jump in here. Ryan asked me to do a sort of not too short, but not too long presentation. And I think this is geared for around 25 minutes or so. Of course, that may change with questions, and any questions I'm more than happy to entertain. I also want to reiterate something Kurt said. We do have some really good people in the room, experts, I would say, in different areas. So I invite them to jump in as well to answer some questions, because I think the goal here is to make this as transparent and clear to everybody as possible. So again, I thank everybody for being here. I also want to, I think Kurt may or may not have mentioned, Janet McCabe is, and many of you may know this, is a summer resident in Wellfleet, which I thought was interesting. So I think we got that's kind of a nice connection to essentially the second highest person in EPA nationally, and hopefully that'll help us going forward. So what I'm going to do is I've got about 30 slides here, and I'm going to try to update and go through really the whole process where I've been involved working with the town. I do want to say I've been working cooperatively, not only with DEP, as Kurt mentioned, they've been fantastic partners here, but the Cape Cod Commission has played a significant role here in terms of providing input. And I know, again, Aaron and Tim and Patty, I think, are here. So please jump in. So let me start off. And again, we can, I'll take this at, I think, a moderate pace, and we can stop when we need to. In terms of goals, really the second bullet is perhaps the one that most people think about. This is a Clean Water Act requirement. Wellfleet, like most Cape Cod towns, have some Clean Water Act compliance issues. We know that because of studies that have been done on the estuaries by the Massachusetts Estuaries Program, or as I will refer to them tonight, MEP. I'll try to be careful with the acronyms as well. Please stop me if I say something that I haven't defined. I'll try to do that. But as you can see on this slide, the goals here really are broader than simply checking the box and complying. There are people in Wellfleet who are very active on affordable housing. The town is very focused on climate change. And so there's a number of goals and objectives here. And obviously we want results to happen as soon as we can. So you'll see that some of the technologies that we're promoting that Janet McCabe mentioned are things that will have a quicker effect than maybe some traditional methods, because groundwater moves slowly, about 1 foot per day. So some of the solutions that we're going to talk about are really either in the water or near the water, and they will undoubtedly have quicker results. Obviously, cost is a really important issue. I'm going to present some information on cost today. It's not the end all. More work is needed, and will be happening to define that further. But Ryan asked me to provide whatever we have at this point, so I'm going to do that. And I think that kind of covers most of the, I guess I didn't mention the co-benefit thing. We want to be mindful of job opportunities here. So some of these technologies are more, provide better opportunities to employ local people than others. And that's something we want to keep in mind as well when we look at some of the alternatives. Kurt mentioned 208. And again, as he said, I was one of the consultants working on this, and I really enjoyed it. And it was a tremendous experience. And I really do think, I teach at Harvard in Tufts part-time, and I have students from all around the country and actually around the world. And I honestly can say that I think this effort is really cutting edge and really a great example of how to do some really innovative planning work. And as Kurt mentioned, not only is this a plan, but it's been endorsed and signed off by the governor and Mass DEP and EPA, et cetera. So we have a plan that provides a pathway to hopefully less expensive, more effective solutions. As I'll get into, this plan really promotes looking at so-called hybrid approaches, both traditional, non-traditional, as Janet McCabe mentioned from EPA. It also promotes a concept of adaptive management, which essentially means let's try things that look promising and see how they work locally, and then make decisions along the way for the most long-term cost-effective plan. This is a slide from the 208 plan, and I just show it. I'm not going to go through this. There's too much information here, but I do want to say there were ultimately some 40 some odd technologies that were examined in great detail. Prior to this study, I believe that, for the most part, conventional sewers and wastewater treatment plants was the primary thing that towns looked at as solutions, which clearly does work and has been used all across the country. But as we've seen in more suburban rural areas, they get expensive and there are other issues. So the intent here was to put a lot of things on the table. There were two committees. One was a local technical committee and one was an international technical committee that evaluated these different technologies. And these essentially got put into the plan. And for those who want to learn more about this, I'll just mention the 208 plan is on the Cape Cod Commission website, as well as a number of supporting documents. It's a tremendous source of information. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to highlight some of these technologies that we are suggesting to be considered here in Wellfleet as I go forward. But as you can see, the list is fairly long. I mentioned the Massachusetts Estuaries Program, or again, I'll mention the acronym MEP. This is a slide that was actually created by the Cape Cod Commission, but it's displaying the data from that MEP report for Wellfleet. And there's a lot to say about it, but in a very brief introduction, the study broke the Wellfleet Harbor complex down into sub-embayments and sub-watersheds, as you can see here. It also did an assessment of in-water water quality and ecological criteria, and then matched that with land use sources of nitrogen. I should mention, I think everybody knows this, but nitrogen is a driver here in terms of the impacts on the bay and the embayments. And so the kilograms, the kg per year means kilograms per year, according to the MEP report, that would need to be reduced to meet the targets. So the MEP report also includes a pretty sophisticated and detailed model that simulates the amount of nitrogen coming from various land-based sources, as well as other sources, as we'll get to in a minute, and then looks at the so-called carrying capacity of the bays. How much nitrogen can they take? And the kilogram per year numbers and the percentage numbers on here tell us how much needs to get reduced in each sub-embayment or each sub-watershed. So you can see it varies quite a bit. Herring River is about 25% under build-out conditions, and then it goes up as high as close to 80% in some of the other embayments. I should also mention, and we'll get to this later too, that the MEP report analyzed this data both on what were existing conditions, and I'll mention that was 2010 when the analysis was done. The report was published in 2017, but for the most part, the water quality data and the land use data is from 2010. So the analysis you're looking at here was actually as of what's called build out, meaning if the town builds everything they can under existing zoning, which of course would be more development than you have now, what then would be the reduction requirements? And I'll come back to this later, but I think this is a good introduction to and give you a sense of sort of how much reduction would be required overall town-wide. And I guess to put it most simply, it's pretty significant. A lot of nitrogen reduction will be required to meet these requirements. But I also want to underline under build-out conditions. Not so much today, but certainly a lot more if development continues under a historical process. So we'll come back to these numbers, but I think this is a good starting point. This is also a figure from the MEP report, and it's what they've done here. And this is throughout the whole watershed.
1 second.
Yes, Ryan, go ahead.
John has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, this is something I've asked in the past and never really gotten an answer to. Referring back to the previous slide, I see that the highest percentages, and I'm assuming that those are percentages that need to be, by which they need to be reduced.
That's correct.
Are in Wellfleet Harbor and particularly in the Cove and in Duck Creek. Those happen to be areas in which there are huge flocks of cormorants and huge numbers of seals. And I witnessed this just, last week when I was down there. There was a large concentration of bait fish and a large concentration of seabirds and seals, both of which, correct me if I'm wrong, deposit large amounts of fecal material in these bodies of water. Has any of this been accounted for in these figures?
Well, John, thanks for your question. Let me go to the next slide, because this starts to get to what I think you're asking about. Okay. These are the sources that are enumerated in the MEP report. And so I think the quick answer is the types of things you're talking about were not a specific part of the assessment. I don't know that they're significant or if there was a reason why they were not included, but I think the short answer is, at least to my knowledge, and maybe I'll ask Tim or anybody else who is equally as familiar with MEP reports, to my knowledge, there has not been an assessment of those sources.
Brian
Brian
had
Dudley
raised
has
his
his hand up, so.
Okay, Brian, please.
Actually, they are accounted for to some extent, because that's what's not reflected in this pie chart. And I think it's important to realize that this pie chart represents the nitrogen load coming off the land. So that's why you see just things like wastewater treatment plants, landfills, farms, et cetera, et cetera. But as part of the protocol of the MEP, there is actually a process by which benthic cores are taken of sediments within the embayments. And if you go to the MEP report, you can see where those cores are taken and the distribution of those cores. And what those measure is the sediment demand of nitrogen, either as a source of nitrogen or sometimes as a sink of nitrogen. And so the fecal material that would be deposited by cormorants, or by other animals or by seals would be addressed in that benthic demand. So while it's not specifically enumerating the number of animals that are depositing, it does integrate their contribution to the benthos and to the sediment. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, to a certain extent, yeah. My concern is that what will happen down the road when we take these measures, which I'm all in favor of. I don't want to be misinterpreted as somehow being opposed to this. And then we still find that there's considerable nitrogen loading in these specific areas where this animal activity is taking place.
Yeah, that's accounted for. That is accounted for in the removals because because the model is looking at the total nitrogen load, and unless you see, I think, a dramatic increase in the population of those aquatic or marine contributors, then I think those reductions are based on taking into account all sources of nitrogen.
Right. I'm just saying that the human sources are what we're addressing is in terms of reducing.
Yeah,
Right. But what I'm saying is that by reducing those human sources, it is accounting for what you can't control as well as what you can control.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I don't want to hold us up. So
yeah, just a quick comment on that too. And Scott will probably come to this later, but that's one of the reasons why our plan includes a wide variety of technologies. There's an awful lot that we don't know, but in particular, Scott will be talking more about this, but shellfish and ecological restoration are key components of Wellfleet's plan, and those do address the natural nutrient and nitrogen sources in that part of the ecosystem. John,
okay.
Great question, and I think that's really important. The other thing that I would mention is there was a study by the Provincetown Center for Coastal Studies, and that basically showed that a significant amount of the nitrogen that's in our black mayonnaise, or black custard as it's called, is coming from marine sources. And so clearly, if we don't do something and don't address conditions in the marine environment, John, you're exactly right, we may not solve the problem. And certainly that's why they're components of the overall plan.
Okay. Appreciate the answers. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for the question, John, and Brian, thanks for jumping in there. Yeah, I do recall that, and that's correct. There is a lot about benthic fluxes in there, which would be water-based sources. This slide does include more than land-based sources, I believe, because that's the precipitation that's called out, I think, is nitrogen derived from direct discharge on the water body. So there are a number of, as Brian, I think, correctly said, There are so-called controllable sources on the land, and then what MEP calls non-controllable sources, which would include this, as it's called here, the water body surface area precipitation, but it is a significant, some of these are significant sources of nitrogen for sure. And I did want to just mention, just out of interest, some of the uncontrollable sources are not static, they're changing. Ivan Valiella from Woods Hole, some of you may know him, he's very well published in this field, did a study a few years ago showing that the nitrogen in that precipitation actually has been declining over the past couple decades. I believe that some of the rationale for that is Clean Air Act enactment or enforcement, et cetera, and other factors as well. But I guess the point here is some of these sources are in fact a little bit of moving targets, which again, I think underscores the need for continued monitoring and adaptive management because, things are changing, I guess is the bottom line, not to even mention, climate change, which is clearly a factor here as well. So let me start to get into a little bit of what we've been talking about for a plan. And this is a graphic that, again, Cape Cod Commission helped me with that I think provides a quick overview, and I'm going to dive into some detail on a number of these individual items. But as we've mentioned a couple of times now, the plan is a hybrid plan. It has both conventional, when I say conventional, we're primarily talking about collection systems, wastewater treatment plants, as well as a number of these non-traditional technologies, as Janet McCabe mentioned, which in this case would include things like the Herring River restoration, Mayo Creek restoration, stormwater retrofits. And as many of you know, we're engaged with Mass DOT right now on the Route 6 retrofit project. And then there are some of the icons on here. The IA refers to these advanced septic systems, or what we call innovative and alternative systems that we'll be talking about tonight. There are some icons out in the water, which identify the shellfish and aquacultural components, which provide an in-water technique that has been documented to have some nitrogen removal credits. So that's a quick overview. And again, we'll be talking about a number of these specifically as we move forward here. So referring to some of the MEP numbers again, and also kind of cross-referencing that with the plan that we put together. On the far left is the so-called existing load. Now, one thing I have done is I've updated that. I mentioned before that the MEP report was 2017, primarily based upon data up through roughly 2010. So one thing I have done is updated that data. So the first number you're seeing there, the 30,271, and these are in kilograms per year, would represent conditions as of more or less today, 2021. The second bar, build out, is where things are headed, again, according to the MEP report, if Title V systems are continued to use and the number of homes and businesses, according to your current zoning, are fulfilled through a build out. So you can see that there's a pretty significant increase as if we move forward sort of with those conventional technologies. The other thing I guess draw your attention to is the line going across the horizontally here. That is the MEP threshold, the 20,000 and change kilograms per year that we need to get to satisfy the Clean Water Act requirements. And then these other bars are approximations, and again, we'll provide more detail on this tonight and certainly beyond tonight, on each of the technologies that we're looking at as possibilities to reduce that to get to the target. And it's my thesis from working now a couple of years now at Wellfleet that I think it's going to really take a collection, a hybrid solution to get there. No one of these solutions I think can cost effectively really solve the problem. So I really think it's going to take a combination of these technologies. The numbers here are best estimates based upon the 208 plan and the so-called technology matrix, which is a document that provides guidance on what sort of nitrogen reductions you can expect from each one of these technologies. But as we all know, reality is sometimes different than projections. So that's the purpose of the adaptive management, to get each one of these technologies going and then monitor them, track them, and make adjustments along the way. And the goal, of course, is to get to the threshold. Yes, Ryan?
Yeah,
Is there a question?
before we move on this, so we can't look at Wellfleet Harbor as having one pool of nitrogen.
Correct.
That we can't just say, all right, well, we need to reduce the harbor load by X number of kilograms. We have to reduce the loads for the various, basically for the various bays and coves of Wellfleet, and specific to each area. So I don't want anybody to think that it's a collective number. I mean, there is definitely a collective number of reductions that need to take place. There's just a wide variety of, I mean, going back to the earlier slide of the reductions required for different areas of the town.
Thank you, Ryan. And Ryan and I have been talking about this, and I've added some slides here, which we'll be getting to, which show this same kind of a reduction in the elements for each one of those sub-embayments.
Okay.
So we'll be getting there, but you're absolutely right, Ryan. Thank you for highlighting that. This is a generalization of the entire town's embayment system.
Okay, and Andrew Gottlieb has his hand up, so.
Andrew?
So maybe this is, you're going to get into this, but your biggest, the reason I'm asking the question now is it's most apparent given the slides, but your biggest decrease is attributable to the third and fourth bars from left to right, the health regulation and IE upgrades. What are the assumptions that are embedded in that for removal rates and performance from these IE systems?
Yeah, Andrew, I am going to get to that. So if you're
And
okay,
I will defer to the time.
yeah, let's do that because I have some slides specifically on that, and it's obviously a great question, an important one. But I think I'll just be repeating myself. If you're okay with that, let's hold on it, and then we can talk more about it later. Thank you.
Okay, and John Wolf.
Just for clarity, that last bar, does that represent the cumulative reduction if the measures represented by the previous bars are taken?
That's correct, John.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, good questions. So I think most people know this, but town meeting earlier this year looked at a number of options to begin work on this project, and the things that were most apparent, we had meetings with many of the town's committees, including the select board, and I won't name them all because I don't want to get it wrong, but I'd say 5 or 6 of the local boards. We discussed these and we went forward with 3 articles for town meeting. All 3 passed with, I think, with pretty large margins. And these are the 3 projects that were endorsed by town meeting and funded. So I will be focusing a little bit on those. They are a PRB, by the way. I told you I would try to define acronyms, so here we go. PRB is permeable reactive barrier, and those not familiar, I'm going to show some slides on that as well. INA refers to innovative and alternative septics, which is what Andrew was just asking about. And then I think everybody knows about the 95 Lawrence project. Town meeting did endorse and fund the design and permitting and construction, I believe, of that wastewater treatment facility at the 95 Lawrence project. So those are the 3 things that are sort of been authorized so far and moving ahead. And I do view those as really key components of this plan. So I think that was really a fantastic move that the town did that. And I think we'll learn a lot in terms of about where this can go. Yes, Ryan.
Scott, before you move on, just for
Yep.
the sake of clarity of people less familiar with this,
Sure.
can you tell us what the yellow circled areas are?
Thank you, Ryan. I should have done that. And maybe I was subconsciously scared to do that because I'm colorblind. But now that you've told me they're yellow, I can proceed. The dots on the map represent individual parcels with on-site septic systems. In general, the larger the dot, the more the flow from that septic, although in Wellfleet, because it has a very limited water supply system, there's not a lot of data. So with respect to Wellfleet, I wouldn't draw a lot of attention to which dots are larger than the others. I believe most of the larger dots represent, or many of the larger dots represent commercial facilities, but not all of them. But that's what those dots represent. And then I guess you can see my cursor here. These other lines represent the watershed lines, which simply means I'll just focus on this is Duck Creek right here. So this line represents the watershed to Duck Creek, which means where does the water come from that gets into Duck Creek, which would mean every one of these dots that you see within this polygon, according to the MEP report, would be contributing nitrogen to this Duck Creek watershed. So thank you, Ryan, for mentioning that. That's something I certainly should have mentioned. And I also should mention the credit to the Cape Cod Commission again here. This is a graphic from their so-called MVP tool, which allows you to look at these subwatersheds in a lot of detail and assess nitrogen loads, how much nitrogen is coming within each subwatershed, et cetera. Since I have this up here, this little squiggly line here represents a potential location of a permeable reactive barrier, but let me hold on getting into that because I do have some slides coming up on it. But thank you, Ryan, for pointing that out. So let me start with the enhanced INA septic systems and explain what they are. And so what we're looking at first here is not an INA system, but rather a so-called conventional Title V system. This is kind of the default, if you will, that is going in the ground statewide. It is essentially a two system. It has a septic tank, which is designed to separate solids. And then that is piped to a leaching facility, which infiltrates the wastewater into the subsurface that gets into the groundwater. Brian Baumgarten is with us tonight I say tonight, almost tonight, from Mass Tech, the Mass Alternative Septic System Test Center and the Barnstable County Health Department. He's certainly an expert on this, so I'm going to defer to him whenever he wants to jump in. Let me just sort of present what I can in the next couple of slides. What I really want to do here is explain the distinction between the standard Title V system, which you're seeing here, and these so-called enhanced or innovative and alternative INA septics. I'll just mention while I have this slide up here that according to work that Brian's organization has done and other people, there is a minimal amount of nitrogen removal that occurs within this Title V system that is accounted for in the MEP reports. Did somebody want to speak or ask a question?
Nope.
Okay. So just to contrast that with this slide, and you can see and I should mention there are several technologies out there that do this, and we'll talk about some of them, although I'd rather not get into vendors or anything like that because many of them have similar functions. So this is kind of a generic slide, and you can see if I just toggle back and forth between this system and this one, you can see here I just have essentially two components. In this system, what we're doing is essentially adding a treatment system in the middle. And there are several technologies, depending on how you count them, approximately 6 or 8 that are have been going in the ground, have some preliminary approvals from Mass DEP, and we'll get to that later as well. Also have preliminary approvals in New York State, where we're talking with those people a lot because they're doing very, very similar things. And these systems are essentially, like I said, intermediate between the septic tank after solids removal. And the intent here is to provide treatment, including nitrogen removal. Several of the systems that, in my knowledge, that are performing the best for our purpose, which is removing nitrogen, are so-called wood chip bioreactors. So these are essentially wood chips, much like the ones we're all familiar with, that essentially go into a tank, in some cases with an aerator, in some cases after another tank. There are a number of different formulations. The wood chips provide a carbon source, or if you will, food for some bacteria groups that break down the nitrogen into nitrogen gas. So it literally disappears into the air. It's really sort of an ideal treatment process. Many of the systems have, before the wood chip bioreactor, you can see something labeled aeration chamber. And that's because the nitrogen removal process is a 2-step biochemical process. It's, first of all, nitrification, which means adding oxygen to the nitrogen species coming out of the septic tank, and then followed by a denitrification process that generally occurs in the wood chip bioreactor to convert the oxygenated nitrogen, which is commonly in a nitrate form, NO3, I remember their chemistry, into nitrogen gas. And these systems are showing to be quite effective. I'll show maybe one or two more slides, and then that maybe might be a good time to talk more or ask questions about it. But let me just go to this slide. And what this is doing is basically comparing and tracking what's been happening with on-site septic technology, let's just say for the past 20 or 30 years. And also some different, I should also add some different estimates of what the nitrogen concentrations are. I'll just clear on the left side, you can see these numbers are in milligrams per liter, which is a very common way to articulate the concentrations of nitrogen in water. So on the far left, back as far as the early 90s, the Cape Cod Commission developed some models to assess the impacts of septic systems. And at that point in time, a number of 35 milligrams per liter was used to estimate those impacts. Little later on, I have 2007 here, but it's actually over a range of years. The Mass Estuary Program, MEP, has developed more specific guidance on that number for Title V systems. And the number that's currently used as an estimated nitrogen concentration leaving the entire system after the leaching field and getting into groundwater is 26.25 milligrams per liter. As of around 2010, that era, there were a number of so-called innovative and alternative septic system technologies developed. Mass DEP reviewed these and permitted several of them. And the most common sort of permit standard, if you will, for those systems has been at 19 milligrams per liter. And I don't want to speak for Brian Baumgarten, but I think he has some data that suggests that's pretty much what we're seeing for performance for many of these systems on Cape Cod and specifically Wellfleet. And I'll stop in about 2 minutes and see if he wants to jump in here, and I hope he does. And then beyond that, starting in just a few years ago, there have been some permits issued by DEP, so-called provisional permits, and Brian Dudley may want to speak to this later, but the DEP has a 3-stage permitting process: pilot, provisional, and general. So these two systems, and these are proprietary systems, Nitro and Nitrex, are two of the technologies, both of which are being used here on Cape Cod, have been issued provisional permits at 11 and 10 milligrams per liter. And then as recently as 2020, in terms of a publication, although they've been working on it a lot longer, that Brian's predecessor, and I think still at least part-time partner, George Hoyfelder, I think deserves a lot of the credit, has developed some technologies that many of us refer to as layer cakes, which are essentially horizontal layers of wood chips underneath the leach field or a subsurface tank filled with wood chips. And some of that data is in the mid 7 milligrams per liter. And then most recently, some of the data from the Mass Tech Center, Brian Baumgartel's organization, is in the 5 to 6 milligram per liter range. So without getting into a lot of detail about the numbers, I think it's fair to say that a lot of progress is being made here. And a lot of the progress and documentation is actually pretty recent over the last several years, maybe 3 to 5 years from my knowledge base and what I've been reading and talking with people about. But maybe I'll just pause there. And Brian, Brian Baumgarten, we have two, actually both Brians probably want to comment on this, but let me start with Brian Baumgarten and see if you can enhance or add to what I've said, because again, you're the expert.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. So I'm Brian Baumgarten, director of the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Test Center. I'm also a senior environmental specialist at the Barnstable County Department of Health and Environment. A couple things I'll add on the 2010 standard IA systems bar. So the systems were only ever required to get 19, and as a consequence, that's kind of what they got. And I think in general, if you take them and aggregate them, they actually do a little bit better than 19. We see probably a median for all systems that have been installed And that's more than 2,000 technologies that have been installed on Cape Cod, individual systems rather. That's actually closer to 17. And one of the key points of this is that they were never required to do better than that. So they didn't, the vendors who put these technologies out never had an incentive to do better than that. And now that towns are starting to pivot towards doing, potentially utilizing these technologies, there has been an identification amongst these vendors to say, okay, well, now let's try to fine tune our technologies and see what we can do to make them better than what they are now. So we're seeing not only these new technologies coming onto the scene, the Nitro, there's a couple others, Fuji Clean system, Hydro Action system, that are being utilized in other parts of the country, specifically in the Suffolk County project, also down in the Chesapeake Bay, which is a huge, also has huge nitrogen problems. Some of the older technologies and the older technology vendors are starting to pivot themselves toward trying to hit better numbers than they have been able to in the past with their existing technologies by making some modifications to them. So I think there's definitely been a downward trend in more recent years simply because the regulatory aspect of this is starting to catch up with what it needs to be, and they're starting to see the writing on the wall that they need to get better, and they're seeing market opportunities for them to jump in and potentially be able to, frankly, make some money. So, yeah.
Brian, thank you. And Ryan, with your permission, I think what I would like to do is see if Brian Dudley wants to add to what I said about the DEP permitting process, because he's certainly the expert on that. And then Andrew, following Brian's comment, I would like to use this slide to start to answer your previous question and then follow it up with another slide. But Brian Dudley, would you like to comment on anything here, including the permitting process? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I certainly want to recognize you being here. And thank you for being here.
Sure, thanks. Well, as Scott mentioned, there are 3 levels of approval for IA systems: piloting, provisional, and general use. Piloting is sort of a little advanced proof of concept, whereby we require up to 15 systems to be put into the ground. And if 75% of them meet the target effluent quality, they are then able to apply to advance to provisional use, which would then allow a maximum of 50 systems to be put into the ground, and 90% of them would have to meet their target effluent limits in order to apply for general use. And once an IA system would achieve general use, they generally would be considered approved or conventional technology. For piloting, it requires between 12 and 18 months of installation, and then the general use for the more widespread field scale testing requires 3 years worth of data, but you can include the number of piloting systems that had already been installed as part of that 50. In addition, the regulations do allow for consideration of data generated from other states who have equal or equivalent climate conditions, and they would have to follow the same testing protocols under the same kind of quality assurance that we require for our testing program. But that is an option in order to generate more data, or perhaps generate data without having to have 50 systems installed specifically within Massachusetts.
Ryan, thank you. And Andrew, let me just start to answer your question with this slide, but I actually have 2 other slides that are going to be much better answering your question, that are much more specific in terms of how we calculated the reductions. But the 3 numbers that I've been using in the modeling and so-called sensitivity analysis to look at likely or probable outcomes have been 5 milligrams per liter effluent, 8 milligrams per liter effluent, and 11. So I've looked at a range of possible performances. And so as you can see from this graph, that kind of spans the last 4 bars here. And I guess what I suggest, you're certainly welcome to follow up your question or comment now, but I do have 2 other slides that are coming up that would more specifically answer your question as to how we use these numbers to then project reductions. So, but I just wanted to mention the 3 numbers for now.
But Scott, Mike DeVasco has his hand up, and
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to guess it may be on this slide. So I just wanted to dive in
Sure,
there if you wanted to.
sure, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question for Brian about, and maybe I missed this, but how far off from general approval are we as far as a timeline? And then a follow-up to that is whether the Department of Public Health would issue a watershed permit prior to having general approval for enhanced INAs.
Well, as far as we don't have 50 systems of either of the or any of the more enhanced nitrogen in the ground. The Barnstable Clean Water Coalition is embarking on a program to get several in there so that we can start, we can start beefing up the number to see if we can advance from provisional use. But I would say we're probably at least 4 to 5 years away from giving a general use approval to any of these systems. And whether or not we would issue a watershed permit, yes, we could, with systems that are under provisional use approval. And as part of adaptive management, we can, continue to monitor their progress. But, and this is not specific to the IA systems, but, as we have stated many, many times, we will require a conventional contingency plan to back up any of these alternative approaches as part of a targeted watershed management plan that would be incorporated into a watershed permit.
Okay, and I just have one quick question after that. So as far as the backup plan, we've gone over this before, but there's some timelines that need to be met in reduction when there's a watershed permit issued. And I know maybe we're getting a little bit off the specific topic we're on, to meet before triggering that backup plan. And these are my, primary questions and concerns is like, if we go ahead and using this approach, what are these sort of timelines that we have to meet in reduction before that would trigger a traditional sewer system?
Well, I think that would have to be worked out as part of the permit. Watershed permits are issued as 20-year permits broken up into 4 5-year segments. So, we would have to look at, I think, what the overall schedule will be, how it will be implemented, how much time we're willing to give to evaluating and demonstrating effectiveness of these alternative systems, but or alternative approaches. It's not just IA systems. It would apply to any alternative approach, but it could range anywhere from, I would say, 5 to 20 years. But that is something that we would have to work out as, when we get down to actually writing the permit itself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then I'm gonna go to Brian Baumgarten, and then Helen has her hand up as well, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add one more thing in relation to the timeline for approval. Yes, the technologies listed on this slide, the Nitrex, are in the process of getting their general approvals. But as I mentioned a little while ago, there are older technologies that are out there that do have general approval at this point that have shown really great promise in some of the other areas. And specifically, I'll call out the Orenco's Advantex RT system, which down in Suffolk County has shown significantly better numbers than we had seen up in our area previously. So there are some generally approved nitrogen reducing systems that have some potential for use in some of the watersheds, while some of these other technologies, which do perform better even than the Advantex unit, work their way through the process.
And what is the performance of the Advantex system?
Looking down in Long Island, it looks like they're in the 11 to 12 range right now. I could get data for you on that. That's all published in the Suffolk County's website. It's just publicly available information for anybody who wants to see it.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, oh, Helen, sorry.
Yeah, Helen?
Yeah, so reference has been made to data from other places through you to Scott or either one of the Bryans. Hey, is there another place that has this kind of soil condition and so forth that would support this in terms of us getting our watershed permit? You mentioned that as being a way to validate use of these systems, but you didn't mention any specific places that are comparable.
Okay, Brian Dudley has his hand up, so Brian?
Yeah, if I could just address a couple things in terms of what Brian Baumgarten just said. Yeah, it may be that some of the ones that have general use approval in some instances are showing better, better performance than 19. But again, they have not applied for that enhanced effluent limit under, for a general use approval. And it would require a demonstration of at least, 50 systems for 3 years and 90% of them performing at whatever effluent limit they would want to get general use approval for. So, I mean, there still is a process for them to be able to demonstrate that. Helen, I think in terms of your question, similar places, I mean, I did mention, states with similar climates. So I would say, offhand, roughly, probably somewhere from the Mid-Atlantic up to Maine.
Well, Ryan, any places in particular that have that many IA systems in the second phase of proofing?
No, I'm not aware of specific numbers.
Thank you.
Okay, and Andrew
Sorry.
Dudley.
Yeah, so Brian or Scott, I appreciate the clarification. I just want to just point out that, going back to the prior slide, the piece that this plan relies on for the single greatest amount of reduction is modeled at 3 levels of performance that you may get to at some point, but are below and more effective than anything on the market that has been approved for general use. And so you may get there, you may not, but as town officials move forward thinking about this, you have to recognize that there is some risk to this scenario that the general use provision levels will not come out to what is being modeled. It's not a reason not to do it, but it's a reason to know and assess what your risks are when you look at overall costs and exposure to the community. Because as Brian has consistently said throughout, you need the conventional plan B. And so, you can't treat the IA performance as equivalent to today, or at any point, frankly, to the levels of reduction you get from conventional treatment. That's not saying you should go to conventional treatment. They're just not the same.
Okay.
Yeah,
and
agreed. I'm
Brian
sorry.
Dudley, is your hand still up, or did you have something additional to add?
I forgot to lower my hand, sorry.
Okay.
Ryan, I guess I'll just respond briefly to Andrew's comment and then maybe move on here.
Yep.
I think I totally agree with you, Andrew. And as I think you'll see here, the plan does include a backup plan. I believe Anastasia is on the call with us from GHD. She's already done some work for the town on the transfer station, which we'll talk about a little later. Which essentially, in my mind, kind of proves out that as a backup plan location for the treatment plant disposal. She's also just beginning to embark upon a project to map out backup sewer, so-called sewer shed plans. So we're fully aware of that as a requirement, and we've been recognizing that since the beginning. It is part of the plan. It will be part of the plan, you know, I think, again, referring back to 208, I think the purpose here is to, as I think we're all saying the same thing, we have a backup plan using a conventional technology. The 208 plan, I think, underscores the validity of an adaptive management plan or approach where the town has the ability to spend a period of time. Brian Dudley mentioned 5 years. That is exactly phase 1 of the plan, to install pilots of some of these other technologies that look promising, and then adapt from there. And I guess the only other thing I throw out in response to your comments, Andrew, which again, I appreciate and agree with, I think there is a trend here. So there are risks. There's a lot of risks with lots of things, but I do think that that there is pretty good evidence to hear that we're headed in the right direction with these technologies. And I think if I were to extend this graph out to 2030, 2040, 2050, which would be the 30-year plan, there may be some smaller numbers on here. So I think that the evidence is suggesting, and again, I'll defer to Brian Baumgarten here, that these are working. They do work, they're reliable, and they're getting better. So that's why I think that's why I'm suggesting that it's worth a look during phase 1. And that's why I agree with you and Brian Dudley and everybody else that, as the 208 plan says, we need a backup plan. And we do, we have it, and we will have it. I think we're all saying the same thing, and I think I agree with everything that's been said, and I think we're headed in the right direction. And I will say, just the other comment I guess I want to respond to a little bit is other places. We had a very good call last week with Chris Gobler, who's the expert down on Long Island and who is doing a ton of work on this same exact issue. And frankly, Long Island is roughly 10 times as many people, 10 times as much money, et cetera, and they are heading in this direction in a big way. They are installing these INAs as their primary solution to dealing with the same exact issue we have here in Cape Cod, a nitrogen issue. Suffolk County and the state government's behind funding these. They're providing, much like we proposed in Wellfleet during phase 1, they're providing financial assistance to homeowners to put these in the ground. So I just want to point that out because that is a similar hydrogeologic environment. I believe, as Brian Dudley said, that's right in smack in the middle of the range he was talking about. Long Island particularly has a very similar hydrogeologic setting. And again, they're heading in this direction. It's working well, and they're making the investment to head in this direction. They believe it's a good risk, or I don't think they look at it as much of a risk as they do as an investment to prevent things from getting worse before they get better. But with that, why don't I move on? And all this stuff we're going to come back to. So these are great questions, and appreciate everybody's input here. Maybe this will help further with some of the discussion we've been having. Ryan asked me to include some cost information, and this is, first thing I'll say is this is still in the works. And I'm talking to lots of people on Cape Cod, lots of people that are in the middle of these projects and all the various towns that are looking at these issues and trying to collect I think, relevant information. So my first point is this is going to get amended. If I make this slideshow in the future, a few months down the line, these numbers might be somewhat different because I'm trying to collect the best available current data. But, and I've got two slides here. This one is on capital costs. The next slide includes estimated operation and maintenance. And the only reason I'm showing these is why would we consider a technology that's not proven against one that is? And one answer is they might be more cost effective. And this is the data that I'm working with. The 28,111 comes from a report and study that was done by the Buzzards Bay Coalition in the town of Falmouth. Cooperators in that project were Brian Baumgartel's organization, the Barnstable County Health Department, and other organizations. They installed a number of these INA technologies, and they actually documented real costs of putting them in. And they also documented performance of those systems. So the 28,111 comes from that study. The cost of central sewer is a number that comes from a variety of sources, including, and it's an average cost. And this comes from including the Cape Cod Commission's MVP model, which predicts costs, as well as research and data provided by several towns in Cape Cod who are in the process of building central sewers and wastewater treatment plants. The range that I found is somewhere between $70,000 per connection, household, if you will, up to around 120 or maybe a little more than that. So I'm using 90 as a midpoint right now. Now, on the other side of that, and we've talked about this many times before, not only in addition to central sewering being, more of a proven technology, which certainly is true, they also probably have, they do have the ability to provide a better effluent. So in this analysis here, I provided the range, again, to go back and answer your earlier question, Andrew, 5 to 8 are the range that I'm using in this report, this analysis, to provide the town, I think, for some reasonable, and I would argue conservative estimates of performance. And on the central wastewater side, I'm using a range of 3 to 5 milligrams per liter. So what this slide does is it integrates the costs and performance information into $1 per kilogram. And so if my numbers are right, then what it suggests is that the INAs might be more cost effective going forward if in fact they perform within this range of 5 to 8 milligrams. And maybe before I take questions on that, I'll just show you the second slide, which is a first attempt to integrate some of the O&M costs. So I've got two sources here. And again, these numbers are more variable. So I'll admit that up front. When I say these numbers, I'm talking about the operation and maintenance costs. The number that was generated from the Buzzards Bay Coalition study for the report that I mentioned earlier is about $1,400 a year. There was a study done, number 2010, which was also updated. I'm going to try to include that more recent data. I reference APCC here, but it also included Barnstable County as an organization. It was the so-called Cape Cod wastewater cost analysis. I will tell you these numbers vary based upon the size of the wastewater treatment facility. So the number I'm quoting here, the 1360, is in the smaller wastewater treatment plant that I think would be most applicable if Wellfleet were to build a system in the downtown area. In the 100,000 to 200,000 gallon per day range. Those estimates are something on the order of $1,300 per year. Again, both of these numbers, the 1,400 and the 1,300, I'm sure people have different experiences, opinions, because I'm talking to people and there's a range. Frankly, some are higher, some are lower. And I've been talking with Brian Baumgartel a lot about this. I know he has some thoughts on the INA costs, but maybe I'll just stop there and see if there are questions on this, because I think this is more responsive to Andrew's question.
Andrew does, but before he goes, so what is the cost per kilogram of reduction that was provided by Bowler for the 95 Lawrence Road cluster?
Yeah, I have that slide in here, Ryan, and I think it was around $300, but let's see when it comes up. I don't remember the exact number, but I'm going to show it.
That includes O&M.
I believe it does. I believe it does.
So for
no, it doesn't.
Yes, it does, Kurt. So
yeah, that's 300.
Yep. It includes O&M.
And Ryan, if I may, not to interrupt you, but
Yep.
I think it's a good point, and that's why I included this slide. And I'll just say that when you look at the costs of these systems, a major driver is the collection system. In many of the towns that I've looked at, that is more expensive, significantly more expensive than the actual treatment plant. So that's a big driver, and collection system is the reason why the collection system cost is so variable is not most, but one of the major factors here in Cape Cod is density. And so I would suggest that one of the reasons, because I've been looking at the Bowler report quite a bit, and as you know, I worked with those people during their project, along with Tim Pasikarnis, who's on the phone here with Cape Cod Commission. Three of us worked together quite a bit on that study of 95 Lawrence, which I think is a great project. And I think one of the reasons why those costs are lower is the density, because you've got a relatively high density project, somewhat unique, I think, to Wellfleet. So I might suggest that that might be one of the drivers as to why those costs are lower.
Yeah, I would say that there's comparative areas within the town that have comparative densities of flow. And, you know, just presenting, I mean, those numbers should be included as one of the, because they are going to be employed in at least there, but it could be by far the lowest cost option within certain areas of the town. And not presenting those figures kind of, you know, comparative. I mean, we're just being presented with central and IA, but we're not.
Well, I haven't gotten to the slide yet. I haven't, it's here. It's coming.
Yeah, but I have an issue with graphs like this, but I'll go to Andrew, so.
God, how do you deal with the fact that with the central systems, the useful asset life is, depending on the features, you know, highly lengthy. And the fact that we don't know yet what the system life, either in terms of performance or the need to replace certain aspects of these IA systems are. So, you know, you've got a mismatch of time sequence in this slide, it strikes me, where the useful life of the central systems is longer. And it appears from this, unless you tell me differently, that there's no assumption made of any installation, reinstallation, or refurbishment of the IA systems that would have a secondary capital cost during the same period of useful life of the harder assets. And if I'm right about that, then it would seem to me that this is sort of first cost, but not lifetime cost of a given period of time for production, and therefore may not be an accurate comparison on an apples to apples basis of the long-term annual comparative costs of the two approaches.
Yeah, good question, Andrew. The INA costs, at least some of them, do include replacement of things, and frankly, some of the technologies. And again, I'm going to invite Brian Baumgarten here because he's more of an expert than I am on this. But on the technologies that we're looking at, the replacement is generally replacing wood chips periodically. In the case of the nitro system, some limestone as well periodically, and we do have some estimates on timing of that and have included those costs of replacement. On the other component are some real small capacity air pumps that, of course, any pumps, including the larger water pumps that are included in a central facility, need to be replaced. I don't know if the capital costs on the wastewater plants include those or not. It's a good comment, and I'll go back and look at it. But I know that on some of the INA cost information, and I'll have to look back, and I can provide details on this later. Happy to. Because we have that, I know, for the nitro system, and we've included that on replacement, estimated replacement. I'll also say that to your point about, we don't have enough experience yet. You're absolutely right. It's a new technology. One of the people that we've been talking to quite a bit over the years, I as well as Brian and George, is a gentleman up in Waterloo, who's, I think, one of the people who started this whole wood chip bioreactor by the name of Robertson. He has published some studies that show that the wood chips are likely to last on the order of decades. And based upon some of the systems he's got operating there, I believe John Smith from Nitro is using an estimate of replacing those every 7 years, meaning being conservative. So you're absolutely right. We don't know because they haven't been around long enough, but we do have some, I think, well-regarded researchers that are suggesting that in fact, the lifespan of these technologies, of the components, is pretty darn good. Of course, the other parts of the technology, concrete tanks, we know about, we know how long those last, but in terms of the air pumps and the media, which is primarily wood chips and limestone, those are included in some of the cost estimates. But again, maybe I'll defer to Brian here if you're willing to jump on here again, Brian, because again, I think you know more about this than I do.
Yeah, just before that, the one other question in terms of lifespan would also be the leach fields.
Right.
So, Brian Baumgarten, if you may.
Sure. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. I want to do just some super basic math on this slide, which is $28,111 and $90,000 for central wastewater. Multiply 28,000 by 3 to get the same. So you could replace the septic system 3 times in the same period of time that it would take for these major investments. So, I mean, it's not entirely, and you're probably not even going to be replacing the full system if you did. So while that cost may not be included, the basic math would show you could replace the system 3 times for that same amount of money. And that's something I think really to consider here. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the operation and maintenance costs. I've seen a lot of numbers floating around over the years. I have very firsthand knowledge of this because we track 2,500 on-site innovative systems on Cape Cod. And the 1,400 number, the 1,800 number that I've seen floating around are based on the current paradigm of management. I'm working with Patty and Tim at the commission, along with folks from EPA and with Brian Dudley at DEP and others at DEP to develop a model for responsible management entities, which I believe when you start to manage these things as infrastructure, you can significantly drive down the continuing operation and maintenance costs. If you're able to reduce the amount of sampling using a program like that, if you're able to reduce the amount of operation and maintenance visits that have to occur utilizing sensor technology, remote sensing technology, you can drive that cost significantly below what you're seeing on this slide. And I believe we can easily get below $1,000 per year for the operation and maintenance on IAA systems based on the analysis that I've done myself.
Okay, John Wolf.
Yeah, from what I've been given to understand in previous discussions about these systems, the wood chip based IA systems have a minimal reliance on moving parts. Basically, a fan that has such low energy demands, it could probably be met through solar power, whereas a central system, we're talking about quite a bit of machinery with large electrical demands, pumps, roots blowers, air compressors and so forth, all of which require regular maintenance and a considerable amount of energy to run them. Am I correct? Or in the ballpark?
Yeah, if I may. Injecting air into wastewater is one of the largest energy uses in the entire world. I think it's something like 3% of all energy use goes into just blowing air into wastewater at treatment plants.
Okay.
Brian, if I might, in the interest of time, we have a lot, there's obviously a lot here to unpack. And
respectfully, Kurt, can you just allow
yeah, if you'd let me finish, sure. There's a lot to unpack here. The NPV, the calculations for, well, Hillary might have something else to say about our opportunities for cluster systems elsewhere and that as an option. I think what Scott's really trying to do is get an overview here of options for technologies not debate specifically every individual technology and all its warts and so on. The idea here is to have a plan with, as Brian Dudley mentioned, 5-year increments to be able to evaluate technology. And I feel like we're getting into a debate about technology, and I think we can have that debate. But I think in the interest of time, it'd be useful to look at the comprehensive nature of the plan that Scott's working on here.
Fred Vanderschmidt.
Yeah, I just have to tell everybody I got a hard stop at 6:30, I'm arriving late and leaving early. So you can,
Okay.
you can take it. The other thing I just want to say real quick is I've seen the majority of these slides. I know exactly where we're going. We have done a lot of hard work on this, and especially Scott and Kurt, but all of the people on the Clean Water Board, I guess is what we're calling ourselves these days. So I just want to point out, these are great options for the town. Understanding them is great, is minimal. And I hope we all, just recognize that.
Okay. So I'm going to go to Helen and then Brian Dudley. Helen?
Shit. Okay.
Hey.
Nobody's brought this up. I'm always very focused on a municipality's capacity to function well with whatever infrastructure they take on into the future. And the IA systems have the advantage at this end of the Cape with our shallow land mass. It gets much thicker when you get to the north of Eastham. IA systems for exactly our conditions are safer because A, they return water from where it's taken. B, if a large sewer system malfunctions, as it has in Provincetown fairly soon after they, put pipes in the ground and so forth, the stakes are way too high here. A lot of what's needed to be dealt with is in and around our harbor. And if you have a malfunction of a large sewer system in that area, it will affect our single biggest industry, which is shellfishing. Never mind blow the 208 plant out of the water, because a big leak is a lot more trouble than one IA system needing a little maintenance. And just to be cold and hard, yeah, the town may help individual property owners fund these systems when they get put in. But after that, the maintenance will be up to the property owners, just the same way it is with Title V. And I think that's a much better plan than having the taxpayers take on huge expenditures into the future for, a larger system.
Okay, well, there's going to be an issue with that. I'm sure Brian Dudley can elaborate.
Thank you. We need the backup plan. I get that. We have to have.
No, this. So Brian.
Yeah, a couple things. Just briefly to touch on the energy question. We're very aware of energy issues, and we make that as an essential component of any state revolving fund loans that we issue for new treatment plants, that they have to be energy efficient, and there are options to cut down on the amount of energy that is used in those plants. But I think probably the more important question is regard to operation and maintenance. The department will not, and I can say this unequivocally, we will not approve a plan that relies on individual homeowners to conduct operation and maintenance of IA systems. It is going to have to be under a municipally sanctioned and administered program. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have municipal employees out there. You can certainly contract it to a third party, but it would have to be under a municipal contract where the municipality would be administering and controlling the functions of that third party. I cannot be more emphatic that our experience in the IA program as it is now, relying on homeowners, has taught us that for any kind of program for TMDL compliance that relies on IA systems cannot be relied on to have O&M done by homeowners.
Ryan, may I just say to Brian, yes, I should have added, we all went over that very carefully before town meeting, and I should have referred to it. I thought it was general knowledge. In other words, the oversight of the maintenance of the IA systems has to come from the municipality. I thought that was a given. I'm sorry that I didn't, express that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I know Patty Daly is here too, and she may want to speak on this. And Brian Baumgarten mentioned there are a number of ongoing activities, including DEP and EPA and all these other organizations we've been talking about, to develop a model, so-called RME, Responsible Management Agency, because as you just said, Helen and Brian, 100%, I think we're all in 100% agreement of what Brian said. I mean, 100%, everybody agrees with that. We know we need to do that. And I totally understand why. And that's why both Cape Cod Commission, as well as the Water Environment Federation and other organizations have set up committees of experts to develop models and approaches on the best way to do this. And again, not to put Brian Baumgarten on the spot again, but I know he and I have been talking a lot about how this might apply to Wellfleet, because I think his organization could be a key player and might be, frankly, might be the first place on Cape Cod, although Falmouth, I think, is close as well. They're talking about this a lot, at implementing the management structure that Brian is suggesting we need, that we all agree 100% that we need that. And so that is I think there'll be some very specific proposals for Wellfleet if they decide to go ahead with this on exactly how to do that. I believe that the Barnstable County Health Department will likely be a key player in that, or I would certainly like them to be. I think they have a lot of expertise. So again, I think we're all on the same page there. Brian, I don't know if you want to speak to that as well, or Patty.
Yeah, I would just, Barnstable County is definitely committed to assisting towns with the management of these systems as they move forward, as it has, even through the older technologies. We, like I said, we track all of the existing innovative alternative septic systems that are out there, and we are beginning to put together our internal framework and resources to be able to meet that future demand, so that if you decided to move forward, are ready to do that, and you want to avail yourselves of the service from us, that we're ready to go to support you in that.
Okay, I'd like to go to Mike DeVasto and then move on if we may. So
Yeah, just from what Brian Dudley said, I just want to be made clear, I guess, that what he stated doesn't seem to preclude homeowners from potentially having to pay the cost of maintaining and upgrading, just that it would have to be administered from the town. So the town could charge fee or a yearly payment into a fund or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that does seem to be a possibility to move forward, that, the town administrates it, but the homeowner may be on the line for it. We do have several, $1 million+ properties that I don't necessarily think that all taxpayers should be funding their their septic system upgrades or their septic system maintenance. So I'm not sure on that, but it does seem like there is some room to have the homeowner pay at least a substantial portion of that.
Ryan, should we move on?
I think so. John, is your hand just still up or?
Oh, I think I must have forgotten to put it down.
Yep.
Okay, so here's the, you asked for this, Ryan, 95 Lawrence numbers. This is from Bowler Engineering, excuse me, who did the engineering work for the 95 Lawrence project. As I think everybody knows, the project was originally planned just as a single septic, INA septic for the housing project. And Cape Cod Commission, we got involved with looking at the alternatives of expanding that program to a neighborhood system. And as you can see from these numbers, the cost efficiency goes up significantly. The bottom line there, I'll just point with my here, net annual cost dollars per kilogram goes from roughly $4.50 down to roughly $2.50 by including the neighborhood and scaling it up. To your point, Ryan, later, I will check on the densities because my belief is this is largely density driven, and then you might be absolutely right. There may be other areas in town that have similar densities. I do think that's something that Anastasia is going to be looking at as part of her analysis. And I say that not to put her on the spot, but she and I have talked about that quite a bit. And we're going to be, and I think she's going to be looking at other areas in town that might have similar densities where some additional so-called cluster neighborhood systems might be warranted. And I know, Ryan, you and I have talked about this as well. So I think it's a very good thought.
Yep.
But in any case, those are the numbers.
And just for clarity, that number includes the annual O&M.
It does. It does.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, so that brings us to a health regulation draft that we've been talking about with the Board of Health. And we recently had a meeting, so several of you attended, a joint meeting with the Conservation Commission. This has been somewhat revised since that discussion. I'll go through it very quickly because most of you are probably pretty familiar with it. And this is, again, just drafted for discussion at this point. So the first section and then enumeration here tracks the existing health regulations. That's what the numbers are about. But the first one basically would be a requirement to install these. And there are options here, right? This one says for all new systems, for repairs, upgrades, and property transfers. You may not want to do the property transfers. That's something that's completely up to you. Although when we get later, if we have time to looking at the 30-year plan, you will see that the rate of adoption of these technologies with a regulation like this, in fact, without the property transfers, might be adequate to get us to the goals within the 30-year timeframe. So that's the driver in the regulation. The 609 paragraph is an attempt to clarify what this regulation would mean by an enhanced INA. And we're going to use, the proposal here is to use the 10 milligram per liter mark. Rate, as it says right now, based upon the data that I've reviewed, there are a few systems that would probably meet that criteria, the nitro, nitrex, and some of the so-called layer cakes. I do want to say that the intent here is not necessarily the permit number, but the actual documented performance in the field. And what I mean by that is, for example, the nitro system is permitted at 11, but if the town puts in, let's say, 50 of these systems and they perform at 5 or 6 milligrams per liter, we would recommend that as part of the permit and the plan that DEP consider giving the town the credit, not for the 11 number on the permit, but for the actual performance data. And of course, that would have to be documented through an agreed upon RME, responsible management entity procedure, agreed upon testing protocols, et cetera. But just to clarify, the 10 milligram per liter is based upon as it says here, the third-party performance data in the field. And then the last paragraph, 610, would be basically an allowance to, just in case, because the question came up during some of our Board of Health discussions, what happens to a homeowner who installs one of these systems and then the town puts in a sewer at some point? And this would provide the ability for them to continue on that system as long as it's performing correctly. And then the last note is simply, again, a reminder, the town did authorize $250,000 to install X number of these systems. The discussion was that the town might provide an assistance of 12.5 per property, which would enable somewhere between 10 and 20 of these systems initially, hopefully this year, and hopefully move some of those technologies closer to general permit. Going back to the prior discussion, the Nitro system, which is one of the ones I'm most familiar with, I believe now has 21 systems installed, 20 or 21. Actually, one is going in next week, so I'm not sure if that number includes that or not. So if the town of Wellfleet were to install another 10 or 20 of these over the next year or two, we'll be getting close. And I believe there will be, I know there are others going on in Martha's Vineyard, town of Falmouth. I think that it's likely we could get to the 50 number during this first 5-year period. And again, want to reiterate what Brian said. I agree with him. 5 years is probably the right time frame to think about getting those on the ground, getting them tested, and assuming they perform, getting them to general permit. But again, my understanding is we don't need to wait to get the general permit to use these, to get credit for these, and to include them in a watershed plan as long as DEP approves that with the appropriate backup plan. So this is what the regulation is proposed as. We've had a couple discussions on this. I guess I'll leave it at that. I know Janet is here from the Board of Health. Maybe she wants to talk to this. I'm not sure, but I'll open it up for Q&A on this reg if anybody wants to speak to it.
Okay, Mike.
I guess first of all, I have a concern about a requirement to use enhanced, innovative, and alternative septic systems because currently they won't meet our thresholds unless they're the enhanced ones or ones that have been modified and are still generally not don't have a general approval for that specific level of nitrogen reduction, right? So the innovative and alternative septic systems that are currently generally approved won't meet our goals. It doesn't seem alone. So we are requiring them and then basically offering a subsidize for people to put something in that isn't generally approved. And now I know it's provisionally approved, but in a way, I feel that we may be forcing people's hands into putting in a system that they might not feel confident in because it still lacks general approval, or going with what, as a consumer is proven technology, but won't get us to where we need to be. And so I'm a little skeptical of putting this regulation into effect right now and basically requiring people to either put in INA systems that don't meet our needs or innovative septic systems that are not generally approved yet. So those are my two real concerns about this. And then the other thing is when it comes to say we had to put a backup in and we can say anyone who's installed an alternative septic system can use that septic system, but it may be like, 5 or 10 years down the line, how many people have installed these systems and then we introduce a sewer system or a comprehensive traditional sewer system, and we have 50% of the properties in, say, the downtown district that don't have to connect to it. So then the cost of operating that system is divided by those who can connect or need to connect. And that becomes another problem when you look at the overall cost, similar to our water infrastructure that we have in this town, where we didn't require everyone to get on town water, and the basically system can't pay for itself. I mean, there's definitely drawbacks to what's being proposed here. And, honestly, I don't think I'd be comfortable requiring a regulation that doesn't meet the goals that we've set. Because say everyone we require goes, well, I'm just going to use the accepted technology. Well, that's not going to get us there. So if we have everyone in downtown going like, well, I have, you know, a whatever $2 million home, whether it's 70,000 or 30,000, I don't really care. I'm putting in the one that I know is a generally approved system. And then we kind of have put ourselves in a bind there, right? It seems to me that we are, by putting this in, putting the cart before the horse. I just don't think we're ready for this regulation because, you know, basically because of everything that I've outlined here. And if somebody sees it differently or can sort of sway me another way, I'd be happy to hear it, but I see several pitfalls in this.
Ryan, can I just quickly respond to Michael's comment? Ryan, I'm sorry, Michael, thank you. The last draft of this regulation, 608, basically provided the use of these as an option. Hillary's on the phone here, but there's an existing regulation the town has that requires regular INA systems, the 19 milligram per liter system in certain areas. And as you said, the thought is we're requiring, or some of the people in the town are required to put these systems in. And as you said, we kind of know they're not going to get us to the solution at that level. So the previous draft gave it the option to a homeowner. They could either put a 19 milligram per liter system in, or with the 12.5 assistance, give them the option to go to the enhanced system. So that was what it said that before, and certainly that could be the situation. So I don't disagree with what you said at all. I think I totally agree with you. The other thing I just want to respond to is we've had this comment or question many times about if we start putting these in, sewers will never be affordable. The number of systems that would go in, and we'll see this when we look at the 30-year plan during this first 5 years, would be somewhere in the order of 5% of the systems are going to be need to meet the goal, 5 or 10%, that range. I don't believe, even worst case situation, that is going to make a potential sewer system unaffordable, or excuse me, unaffordable, if in fact the town decides to go that way in the future. That's the whole idea of the first 5-year program, to do a limited pilot program, convince us that in fact the trajectory is correct, that things are getting better and better and better. And we're so I think both of your points are very well taken, and I agree with both of them. But I think there are some solutions to that, and perhaps we need to go back to the former draft of the regulation for consideration. But I'll stop there.
Chair Curley, would you mind if I follow up quickly?
Yes.
So what's written in front of us here would require all septic systems, right? And so that's where I find issue with it. And wouldn't we want to propose and have a accepted watershed permit, which allows for these types of systems, before we would create a regulation in town to start requiring anything? I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, if you have to put an INA system, we'll subsidize you to put an enhanced INA system that's only provisionally approved. And, you know, that's up to the homeowner. Maybe it makes sense if the price is right and they are sold on the fact that they can contribute to nitrogen reduction. But not having a watershed permit and then making this requirement, I think is a mistake. I think really we need to assure people that this is going to be an accepted permit and an accepted process that's been permitted with all the delineations and requirements and timelines with the Department of Public Health, and grant that watershed permit to do this before we start making requirements.
Okay. So I'm going to go to Janet Drohan, and then Kurt, and then to you, John. So,
Okay.
So Janet hasn't spoken yet. So you're muted, by the way, Janet.
Thank you, Ryan. And I want to thank everyone who's been here today for this very excellent presentation, especially the two Brians and Andrew and Scott, etc. And I appreciate what Michael is saying. And I would just like to say, and I think I speak for the Board of Health, we have not decided on a Board of Health regulation. at all. Many of the components of this have not been discussed in our committee and team. And I would like to, as a member of the Board of Health, really hold off any comments on this from the Board of Health. And I hear the pros and the cons, and we're all listening. Thank you.
Okay, Kurt?
Yeah, just one quick comment, Mike. If this were to be adopted, there's really no downside to somebody who puts in an advanced treatment system, regardless of whether it's provisionally approved or not. If let's just say the technology didn't work at all, the worst case scenario is you have a Title V system installed. You could repipe it, and it's still a Title V system. The difference here is that there's very promising technology that reduces nitrogen. Brian Baumgarten and others have talked about having very, very good track record out there. So in terms of risk, I think the risk is relatively well mitigated. And the other thing is, we've all got to keep in mind that a couple of towns got sued because they continued to let Title V systems go in the ground. So I see this, and again, this is up to the Board of Health. We have the Clean Water Advisory Committee has no stake in this whatsoever, other than trying to provide technology to the town, that the town can use to meet its Clean Water Act requirements. It's up to the town how that gets implemented. So other than that, I think what Scott's tried to do is craft something that would give us some cover from potential lawsuit by continuing to allow Title V to go in the ground, and provide a way forward with regard to a watershed permit.
Okay, John Wolf.
Yes, a couple of questions. First, the nitro and nitrex systems, are those the wood chip systems?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It seems to me that, well, suppose, for instance, suppose I wanted to be one of the guinea pigs and install a nitro system. Is there a process in place for me to do that? And the reason I ask is it seems to me that in order for us to see this watershed permit eventually take shape, they're going to have systems in place in order to on which to base that decision. And I tend to agree with Kurt. I'm having trouble seeing a downside to putting one of those systems in. What would be is there a process in place for doing that now in advance of any regulation? I guess is what I'm asking.
Yes. These kind of systems are going, as I mentioned in Barnstable, there's, I don't know what the number is, between 10 and 20 of these systems going in. That's the plan over the next year. I think there are 6 or 8 going in the next, will be 6 or 8 have gone in the next month or so. And so they're doing it, they don't have a regulation, that they're being subsidized by the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition. So yes, these, and Hillary, I defer to Hillary on this, but the town has approved a number of installations of INAs. I believe not all of them are general approval. Hillary, I think what's the system from New York that you said there's a couple of these in town? Sorry, I can't think of the name of it.
A Fuji Clean.
Yes, Fuji Clean. So yeah, I think the answer is yes, these can go in as part of the existing, you don't need the regulation to put these in. I think it's the best way to answer your question.
Again, and as per Brian, not Baumgarten, the other Brian. I'm having trouble with the last
Brian Dudley.
Brian Dudley. As per his comment on the regulatory aspect of having these systems, yes, they require maintenance periodically, as has been pointed out, probably only every 7 years at most. What would be? I'm trying to envision what the town's role would be in enforcing this, instead of leaving it just up to the homeowner to do it as you know, as we sort of have to do now, you know, with our Title V systems. You know, nobody comes around and tells me I have to pump it out. It's up to me to have somebody come over and evaluate it, and if necessary, pump it. But with these enhanced IA systems, are we looking at a mechanism through town government to either sample or otherwise monitor these systems so that we get compliance? I'm trying to see how this would work.
John, I'll just maybe, if I may, Ryan, just briefly, there are a couple of models that EPA has developed nationally on these responsible management entities, actually 5 of them that we've been looking at in detail. And Model 4 and Model 5 are the ones that we feel are the most appropriate. And in both of those cases, it would really shift the responsibility of the homeowner to this RMU structure that we've been talking about, which could be the town in conjunction with the county, in conjunction with a contractor. In terms of how that might function.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, was that a question through you to me?
If you would like to answer it, Brian, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah. I don't know where the 7 years came from, because even under Title V, the recommendation is that a septic tank be pumped every 3 years. However, IA systems are a much different animal. And even under general use approval, they're required to be sampled at least twice a year. We have proposed a protocol that would be a little less stringent in terms of the sampling requirements, where we would allow for 10% of the systems randomly selected to be sampled monthly, which means most would only be sampled once a year, with a few being sampled twice a year. And having monthly visits out to each system only to ensure that they're working, to ensure that the blowers are blowing and the pumps are pumping. But we also have a provision in there that if a remote sensing protocol through telemetry were robust enough to ensure that we could be confident that the blowers are blowing and the pumps are pumping, we might be able to forego those monthly inspections. But we would still require the sampling. And, you know, while I appreciate, you know, a lot of the hard work that is being done by the commission, you know, through their RME group, I just want to, you know, say that ultimately it is going to be the department's decision as to what kind of sampling and operation and monitoring protocol is approved. And we have done that. You know, we have set out what we consider to be the appropriate monitoring, operation, and maintenance protocol in a report that was funded through the Southeast New England program grant funding mechanism for Pleasant Bay, that essentially, I think, elucidates what our specific monitoring protocol would be. And it is essentially what I just said. You know, 10% of the systems being monitored monthly, and I'm sorry, 10% of the systems being monitored. Yeah, 10% of the systems being monitored monthly, meaning that most of them are monitored once a year, some being monitored twice a year, and then monthly visits just to ensure that mechanically they are operating.
Good, Ryan, if I could, just,
if you can keep it really brief.
yeah, I just wanted to clarify that the 7 years I was referring to wasn't sampling, it was referring to the one of several estimates on how often the wood chips would have to be replaced
Okay.
based on monitoring the output.
So there's a couple things. The first is that adopting a regulation like this does not in any way whatsoever protect the town from lawsuits. The way to protect the town from a lawsuit is to complete the application and have an accepted watershed permit. That protects the town from a lawsuit. Installing 30 or 40 systems of enhanced IA systems will not cut it in terms of protecting the town from a lawsuit. So anytime that is being raised as a possibility that this regulation would and somehow meaningfully impact any legal or court action is completely misconstruing and misreading the situation that is faced by the towns across the Cape. There is a concern on this regulation that, again, Wellfleet is proposing, or that it's been proposed again, including, again, that we're basically potentially having a municipal, water infrastructure system that's optional. And that really puts the town in a bind in terms of financing the operation of a system of that nature. Would the model for a potential sewer system, would it be based on the flow volume going in? Would you have a connection fee? Would you have would it be a betterment? Would the betterment be affecting these people that have enhanced IA systems installed? It's just the thought that there would be any degree of optionality, and that's actually beyond the ability of the Board of Health to determine, because if a sewer system has to go in within a certain area, a sewer system has to go in within a certain area. I am also very concerned about the process. So for those who do not know, this is a regulation that has already been proposed to the Board of Health on numerous occasions, starting on May 12th of this year. It has not come before the Select Board. I would like to remind the Clean Water Advisory Board that they are an advisory board of the Select Board. And to commit the town to a certain course of action without consulting the policymaking board of the town is ill-advised. The implication is that implying that the town has necessarily fully funded a subsidy program for systems that are not in general approval over the course of the lifetime of 30 or 40 years is also that has not been discussed or decided upon. I would like to think that overall the townspeople would be favorable to it, but it has not been acted upon, and implying that we are already committed to a certain course of action before it's been decided is also misleading. And then on that note, yeah, I'll turn it over to Andrew Gottlieb.
I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually a defendant in the lawsuit that was referenced in my role as a selectman in the town of Mashpee. So let me just tell you where we are. We've got a notice of suit. We have not been served. We will be contesting the allegations in the suit that the town is violating Title V. It is a subjective matter of interpretation of law. And, it certainly seeks the litigant plaintiff certainly seeks to create new legal ground by the suit, but you know, it's not as if their claims have been tried and found worthy by a judge or a jury. It's a set of claims over which we have not even entered the judicial process. So they might be right. They might be wrong. They might settle for something. We might settle for something. But you know, it is not the plaintiff's allegations should not be treated as settled law. They are just what they are, which is a set of allegations which remain to be adjudicated and get their day in court in Mashpee, Barnstable, or someplace else. That someplace else might be you, it might not be you. But I wouldn't overreact to it at this point. Second thing, and I think, you know, Mr. Chairman, your comment about the best way to insulate yourself from litigation was dead on. The most valuable, most under-recognized and appreciated aspect of the watershed permit is that once you have one and you're in compliance with it, and compliance can be not having achieved water quality goals, but implementing the plan that was presumed and approved as part of that watershed permit, you are insulated from third-party litigation. That is the best legal mechanism in Massachusetts available to towns that are not pursuing a standard conventional wastewater treatment approach to solving their problems. So if you want to insulate yourself from litigation, you're dead on. Get a watershed permit and start to do what you said you do, whatever that is, in compliance with the timeline of that permit, and then they will not be serving you with litigation.
Okay. Mike DeVasto.
Yeah, I was just wondering from Brian Baumgarten, what is the subsidy being offered in Barnstable for putting a system in? An enhanced INA system currently.
So Barnstable County isn't offering a subsidy right now. I could only imagine maybe you're talking about the Shubal Pond project that's associated with the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition.
I'm not sure. I just thought you had said that there was funding going into these 30 or so projects. Enhanced INA systems that are being utilized from somewhere. Maybe it's not from Barnstable. Maybe I misheard you. Who's paying for all the systems that are going into the ground in Barnstable?
Brian Baumgarten, can you?
Sure. If we're talking, so I can only speak about the Shubal Pond project, which is to install a number of nitro technologies. The Barnstable Clean Water Coalition itself is subsidizing the cost in that particular case. Their board approved a large set of funds to be able to do that, and they are the ones subsidizing those installations in that particular neighborhood. And that's not 30 installations. Right now, I think they've got 15 lined up for that particular neighborhood at this time.
Okay, and full cost of them or subsidy?
The Barnstable Clean Water Coalition is funding the installation aspect of it. EPA has contracted with us at the test center to do the operation and maintenance and monitoring on these systems, monthly monitoring on these systems for at least 3 years. And I believe the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition has committed to continuing that contract beyond the 3 years out to a 5-year timeframe.
Okay, and do we have any idea who's funding the other systems in Barnstable? Are they just being paid for by private homeowners, or because there's no regulation, but there does seem to be a lot of systems going in the ground?
I couldn't speak to every single project. In most cases where these systems, the nitro, and I'm only speaking about nitro systems at the moment, where those are being put in outside of this Shubal Pond project, to my knowledge, those are funded by homeowners. Though if they are in the town of Barnstable, there may be some subsidy coming from the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition as well. I couldn't speak to that. You would have to check with Z Crocker of that organization for that detail.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Helen.
No, I took my hand down.
Okay. Kurt?
Yeah, I just have a brief comment. Since I do feel a little bit personally attacked about my comment having to do with protecting the town from a lawsuit. And what I said very clearly was, if we continue to let Title V systems go in the ground, we're at risk. And what we're trying to do is avoid that. And clearly a watershed permit, provides some insulation. That doesn't mean that we're not going to get sued either. But the basis of the CLF lawsuit is preventing Title V's from continuing to go in the ground. And those were my comments. And I feel a little bit personally attacked by both the chair and our dear friend Andrew Gottlieb. And so I do feel, that that needed to be clarified. Thank you.
Okay.
Should I move on,
yes.
Mr. Chairman? Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll try to go at a little bit quicker pace here and stop me, but I think, again, most people, we're moving into the other technologies. As I said at the beginning, this is not simply a sewer or INA plan, and there's a number of other technologies. So very quickly, one of them is a permeable reactive barrier. This is showing a so-called trench method in cross section. Really what we're doing here is intercepting the groundwater that has the nitrogen in it before it gets to the receiving waters. Shown here is Swan Pond, but of course that would be something like Duck Creek. Another option that's being utilized in Eastham and Orleans is an injection well system for permeable reactor, where you're injecting essentially an emulsified oil that has carbon in it. And that provides the food source for these same bacteria that I referred to earlier, that the same ones that operate within the nitro wood chip systems, or the Nitrex wood chip systems we were talking about. These systems are on the Cape. There are actually systems in Eastham, as I mentioned, Orleans and Falmouth. And they are all working quite well in terms of the data that I've seen in terms of performance. So it is a technology that we think might have some validity. I've been talking a little bit about Long Island, and I was actually participated in a workshop down there this past year. They've developed a third type of technology, which they refer to as a bulkhead PRB. And you can see from the aerial here, the idea in this case is to install the reactive media, which again is wood chip based, along with a bulkhead installation. And the interesting thing about this technology is, if you look at the costs of any of these technologies, these PRB technologies, the number one cost is the excavation and site work for the installation, not the materials. So the thought here is, and this is what they're doing on Long Island, is when a property comes up for a shoreline retrofit or repair, they're looking at the possibility of installing these reactive cells along with that system. And according to, again, Dr. Gobler, who's the main researcher down there, he's estimating that 80% or more of the cost of installation, it really goes to the bulkhead replacement. So we had a discussion a while back that there are a number of systems around Wellfleet that were shoreline systems are coming up for repair. So this might be something to consider as a possible technology here in the Cape. This is the one in Falmouth that was installed. Again, you can't see it because it's subsurface, but this black rectangle shows where the system went. And you can see along the shoreline here, there's an area where, exhibits the no algae growing. This is based upon the Nitrex technology, which again is the same technology used in the septic system we talked about earlier. This system has been on the ground, I think, for close to, well, it says here somewhere, I think it has a year, yeah, 2005. So 16 years, and this system is still performing quite well. They did excavate it to look at the wood chips this past year, and Ken Foreman, the lead researcher on this, has indicated that very little degradation of the wood chip material. So this is one of the projects on the Cape, probably the only one that's been around that long, that's basically showing us 15 years plus in terms of the longevity of that reactive material. I believe the system is performing in excess of 80% removal of nitrogen. So there are some opportunities to consider. I'll stop there just to consider that technology. I thought I had another slide in here. This is one of the three things that was funded at town meeting to do the initial hydrogeologic investigation and some preliminary engineering design. The town would still need to receive funding to actually construct and monitor that. We believe there's a good chance of getting some grant assistance to install one of these as a pilot project. So that's something that's in the works now in terms of doing it. I'm working with EPA in Region 1 in Boston. Marcel Bellevue, who's their lead hydrogeologist who's working on these PRBs, has offered his assistance to work with me. We're looking at a site along Commercial Street as a potential pilot project. And as I said before, the town has appropriated $50,000 to do that initial investigation. So the idea would be the town would bring on a contractor to install some wells and do the assessment as the next step in that investigation. I'll keep going here, Mr. Chairman, unless there are questions on the PRB.
I do not see any.
Okay. So the other component of the plan, which many towns have included in their plan, is shellfish aquaculture. Wellfleet, as we know, is a leader in this, not only Cape nationally, but probably internationally. It appears, I've been working with Nancy Chavetta and others in the Shellfish Constable, the Shellfish Department, as well as the Shellfish Advisory Board. This graph is showing the last 16 years, I think, 13 years of landings. As part of the Cape Cod 208 plan, again, technology matrix was developed. There was a technical group that met for quite a while and developed agreed upon removal rates for not only oysters shown here, but clams and other species. And this is a calculation of the removal rates over the last 15 years. It does show an upward trend of around 90 kilograms per year. The landings are increasing. So I've been working with Nancy and her crew to develop a plan to sustain this very slow continued growth. Nothing dramatic, but initially this was a bigger part of the planning efforts here in town. But my intent at this point is not to increase it, but simply maintain the growth rate and to be able to substantiate these removal rates as part of the watershed plan.
Okay.
Question?
Yeah. So one of the things is that we've had some new grants being issued and some extensions being granted, as well as increased intensification of the use of the grants that were already out there. There is some room for additional intensification on some grants, but some of them are fully utilized at this point. And you know, it's kind of hard. I mean, I don't know how long we can necessarily count on increased production in terms of what's happening out there. The wild landings have been coming down in recent years, so all of our increased production is being driven by grants. There is, you know, the other issue is that it's not durable. What I mean by that is that we could have a significant disease event that would come in and negatively impact shellfish for quite a considerable amount of time. And if we're relying on that to necessarily remove a very large amount of nitrogen from the harbor every year, which a lot of those services it's already currently providing, it already removes a huge amount of nitrogen. But if we have a mass mortality event or a mortality event that significantly reduces the overall population of shellfish within the harbor, we could look at, you know, pretty significant negative impacts that would lead to basically a cascade failure of the fauna of the harbor. There is also an issue of something. I don't know. I'm getting tired at this point. Yeah, I don't know. so that's it. I mean, the other, yeah, that's it basically. So Helen?
Yes, everything Ryan said is true. I think that all of us reasonably know that the enormous number of shellfish we have in the harbor are a positive component in addressing the water quality. But the really good thing about it, which hasn't been mentioned, is that it's Wellfleet's single biggest industry. It's robust, it's green, and the town has an enormous stake in maintaining good water quality because of that. So whatever pressure is coming from the state or the lawsuit or the conscience that is, you know, we're being told we need a conscience, which we already have because of that. Without any of the 208 program plan requirements, Wellfleet would be very into protecting the watershed. And that's part of the reason. Thank you.
Okay, I actually remember what I was gonna say. The other issue is that, you know, the current sampling data for the overall landings. I mean, we all know that last year was basically an outlier where the markets just collapsed because of COVID. But my understanding is that the market this year so far has been kind of up and down. And I do wonder if there's, you know, in terms of the overall seed that's being planted, if that's going to be, if shellfishmen are basically adapting and planting fewer, well, at least oysters, the market for clams is really, the price is really good for that. So we might actually see cohogs offsetting some of the decreased production of oysters. But it does demonstrate that the production is very dependent upon market forces. And we all know that, you know, markets are inherently unpredictable sometimes, even if they do have a positive long-term trend. So that's all on that. So thank you, though.
Yeah, Ryan, I would just mention one thing, I guess, that this is a considerably smaller part of the plan than previous. And I think all the comments I agree with. And this definitely has some volatility, as you can see in the graphs here from the historical data. But I think, you know, according to the numbers here and according to the landings, it is a significant, as I think Helen said, it is currently performing this so-called ecosystem service. And that is likely either maintain or possibly continue increasing. So I think it's at least in my mind, it's appropriate to be a part of the plan, but not necessarily the major driver.
Yeah, and that makes sense with adaptive management as well.
So let me move on here. Not too many more slides. The next section is on stormwater remediation. And this is just a picture of sort of the historical practice, dumping stormwater directly into the receiving waters. And this slide is a project that we built in Barnstable, town of Barnstable, with the town, I might add, town DPW, basically intercepting some stormwater, building this is called a bioretention facility, which is one example of so-called green infrastructure. So this is a small part of the plan. This is, again, comes out of the 208 approach. There was a estimated credit that towns could include in their plans, according to 208. And so I have that in here. As many people know, we're currently talking specifically about the Route 6 project, where I believe there is an opportunity to integrate some of these so-called green infrastructure technologies to develop some of those credits going forward. And as I was speaking with Nancy Chavetta, I think yesterday, there are obviously multiple benefits, not just nitrogen, but as well as, you know, capturing bacteria viruses, which cause closures of shellfish areas and bathing beaches, et cetera. So I think this is appropriate, again, as a small part of the plan. And then there's, we mentioned previously, so-called ecosystem restoration projects. In the middle is the Mayo Creek project, which there's been a lot of discussion of, moving closer to restoration project there. The MEP program does provide a credit for salt marsh areas or suggests a credit in terms of removal rates. And I think the scientific community does agree that salt marshes play a critical function there. So there's been a lot of discussion about this in Wellfleet. On the left, of course, is the Herring River project, which is a very large planned restoration project. On the right is some work that our chairman, Mr. Curley, did a little while back, identifying potential sites throughout the community. So I think this is an opportunity. Again, I've been very conservative here. The only one that's in the plan right now is the Mayo Creek project, but clearly there will be opportunities over 30 years for quite a few of these projects. I will also add that the state of Massachusetts, through the Division of Ecological Restoration, has become very active in these projects, promoting them, providing technical assistance, and connecting communities with very good funding for installation. So I think this is a timely technique to have in the plan. And I think working with the state DER and other agencies, I think there's some opportunities to identify a number of these projects going forward, again, on an adaptive management basis, with Mayo Creek, I think, potentially leading the list of projects that might get implemented. And then that gets me to kind of just a general approach. And I think I just have a few more slides, Mr. Chairman. I know this has been a long process, but I think we're getting close here. And again, I'll go through these relatively quickly. Schematically, this is what's proposed. Phase one is to conduct a number of pilot projects, and specifically the 3 that were authorized at town meeting, testing evaluation, and then based upon that results, then make decisions onto which direction to go. And this is obviously an oversimplified schematic, but this is the intent here. It appears, again, at least my work suggests that the IAs, the enhanced IAs, are a good bet to investigate on a pilot basis, at least, and see our way through. Secondly, I think the PRBs and some of the other technologies I mentioned are worth piloting. Town meeting decided, actually has provided the funding to at least do a pilot or design a pilot. And then thirdly, as I mentioned, GHD is under contract to provide some additional assistance on potential collection systems. They've already completed the work at the transfer station. So this is the general approach that's recommended. And with that, I'll dive into a lot more detail here. And I'm not going to try to go through this, but in detail, but this is essentially the 30-year plan as it stands right now. So on the left here, we've got the 6 phases, 5 years each. And then the categories from left to right: wastewater treatment, storm, and all the things we just mentioned, all the categories. Under wastewater, which has been the focus of our discussion tonight, this includes both the IA program and the collection treatment. The arrows here indicate, at least a preliminary basis, the decision-making going forward. So the plan currently would include, during phase 1, this initial pilot testing of some of these enhanced IAs, as well as the 95 Lawrence project, which was committed to at town meeting, or I'm not sure committed is the right term, but provided funding for. And then phase 2 would include the second phase of that 95 Lawrence project, as well as a decision on the next phase of the wastewater treatment, which could either be the commitment to design the downtown sewers, which would most likely be, in my opinion, the first part of a larger sewer system if the town decides to go that direction, or again, depending on the data, or I should say, continue with installation of the enhanced IAs, and then everything else would follow from that. Again, going to what I think Brian Dudley said earlier, which I totally agree with, we probably could expect to see some results of where this is going during a 5-year period. That being the proving out of the enhanced IAs, further definition of cost, et cetera. So I think the intent here would be to do that during phase 1, which is a 5-year period, and then start making decisions on where to go from there. And I don't, Mr. Chairman, I won't go into this in any more detail unless you want me to, because again, I know time is running late.
Yeah, 1 second. Andrew Gottlieb has a question.
I just had a big question. I'm sorry to take it backward. And I might have missed it. Scott, with the fertilizer controls, are those existing regs or new?
In here. Actually, not a regulatory approach at this point. Frankly, that's something we have not worked out the details on. All as I have done here for both stormwater and fertilizers is simply included the proposed potential 25% credit, the numbers that are in this column. But we have not yet developed any details on that program. As you can see, I think it is the smallest item on the list. So frankly, it's not been a priority for me to at this point, but I think it's something we will definitely have to do.
I just raise it because we're all preempted by DAR regs from doing.
Right, I understand that, and yes, and my own feeling is that I'm not sure that regulations are maybe the best way to get at this anyways, regulating homeowners on what to do, what not to do. I think some public education training type programs might be as effective or more effective. And I base that on some work that we've done in the North and South River watersheds on the South Shore of Massachusetts, where they've focused on this a lot and have been doing mostly training, public outreach, and to achieve some results. So good question. And I don't have, I think this is something we need to specify further, and we will. But that's all I can say about it right now. But I don't think it would not be, per your correct comment here, I think the regulatory approach is probably not the way to go.
Okay, Mike DeVasto. You're muted.
I guess this brings me to just the sort of most important question, and that is where are we in our application process to a watershed permit with the state?
I'll take a first crack at that, and then I'm sure maybe Brian Dudley and others will want to comment on it. But I just want to reiterate what I said before. I have been listening very carefully to Brian Dudley, and he has said many, many times, so I won't make him say it again tonight, that they will not approve a permit without, a permit or issue a permit without a backup plan. And that backup plan, in this case, would include the sewer shed plan. So GHD is about to get underway with that. As I said, they've completed the first part of that. And in terms of Michael, if your question is on timing, if Anastasia is still on the phone, maybe I'd rather not speak for her and see if she could provide a time estimate on how long it might take to get, if that would be helpful to you, Michael.
I also am just curious how long we are away from actually being able to make the application. And then I guess from there, how long it takes to actually get approval, which I'm less concerned about. I'm more concerned about the town in its function as to, how close we are to being able to actually make the application, a full application for a watershed permit and plan, and what steps we need to go through to get there, and how much the select board should and the public should weigh in on that plan before we make an application.
Well, I'll just add, I have drafted a report, which I just got comments from Hillary on today, and I've gotten other comments from the Cape Cod Commission, as well as the the Clean Water Committee, for just preliminary internal comments to make sure I've got the facts right and the names right, et cetera, et cetera. I will hopefully be able to turn that around within a week or two as a document that we can make public to the town. It will still need to include, for sure, and I indicate this in the draft, the so-called backup plan that I'm referring to. So in terms of timing, I think, frankly, as soon as that sewer shed work is done and we integrate it into the plan, I would be in a position to ask the town to review it and make a decision if that's what they want to submit to DEP. Beyond that, I think I'd defer to, if Anastasia is here and she wants to speak to that time frame, or certainly Brian Dudley or others who know the process better than I do in terms of their approval.
Scott, this is Anastasia Rudenko. I'm an environmental engineer with GHD. And to answer your question, I'd estimate about a 2 to 3 month process, depending on how fast decisions could be made as part of that project.
And might, DEP just say, you're 3/4 of the way there, we want this, that, and this. Go back to the drawing board. Is that something that's typical?
Brian Dudley, would you care to put yourself on the spot or not?
Well, I can put myself on the spot, but you can't rely on anything I say because I'm retiring in December. I think the thing is that, Scott in the department has, have been working very closely. He did try to bribe me with a Hank Finkel basketball card.
Nobody knows who that is, Brian.
I thought that was an effective bribe. I thought we had a deal.
But it didn't work. But I think, no, but the thing is, in all seriousness, I think the thing is that, we've worked closely. He has provided us with information. And he's updated us. I think Scott, probably within the last couple of weeks. We've been looking at that, and we need to sit down and just hammer out some final details on that and everything. But what I would hope is that, through an informal process of, communication and transparency, prior to submitting anything formal, we'd have everything pretty well knocked into shape so that our review probably would not result in a lot of comments. If you were to submit it tomorrow, I can't promise that. But I think the thing is that with the working relationship that we have, we can probably fairly well, not guarantee, but give every indication that what you would be submitting would be likely in a relatively final form.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So Scott, in regards to the report, did it go to the entire wastewater or clean water advisory committee?
I believe it did. Kurt, are you still on here?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's good. I don't know. I'm getting really tired. So, but Tim, I can never say your last name. I'm sorry.
Pasikarnis.
Pasikarnis. Okay.
No worries. Thanks, Mr. Chair. For the record, Tim Pasikarnis, I'm a water resources analyst with the Cape Cod Commission. As Scott has mentioned, I've worked in concert with him to help provide information for a number of elements. But I just wanted to bring up, because it was part of Mr. DeVasto's comments, the sort of public engagement, public participation element of this, and note that is a specific part of the review for 208 consistency that a targeted watershed management plan would ultimately undergo, which of course we know forms the basis for a watershed permit. And ultimately that's, that public engagement sort of is ultimately up to the town, but the commission does have a framework for designing that engagement process and helping to target important stakeholder groups within the community. And certainly we can offer that up. Again, it's really getting these plans and then the funding through a town meeting vote. That's really the ultimate barometer of the level of public engagement that's been achieved. And certainly the more participation and better understanding through the community of the plan that can happen before it goes to a vote certainly seems to improve the chances at town meeting. So I can kind of, I certainly can comment more, but I'll leave it there for now. And if there are further questions, I can address them either now or later if we want to discuss just 208 consistency review in a broader sense. Thank you.
John Wolf.
Yeah, I guess at this point, I'm wanting to know what at this, going forward with the goal of getting a watershed permit, what do we as a town, and specifically we as a select board, need to be doing going forward? What's the game plan?
Brian, Dudley.
Well, I think, submitting your targeted watershed management plan, basically. That really is the technical backbone of a watershed permit. So that would include, things like the timeline that has been presented here tonight, along with, the contingency plan, the conventional backup, which is currently being, developed.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as I said, if we're able to coordinate our reviews prior to a formal submittal, then it should be a relatively seamless procedure in finalizing the watershed permit. And at that point, frankly, the administrative function of actually writing the thing is what is more, the most difficult part of it. On our end, you guys have done the difficult work of coming up with the plan, so I don't want to minimize that in any way. But essentially, it's coming up with an acceptable targeted watershed management plan, and then we will craft the permit based on that.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, Scott, maybe we can move on.
I think the only other thing I have in here, well, actually, I'm sorry. Well, I just want on the subject of public participation. As most people know here, we've done a number of meetings. I don't know how many, but quite a few. Not only public meetings with the Clean Water Advisory Committee, but with the various boards. But there is, I think, a pretty good website. I just want to let everybody know this. And you can see on the left side, there's information on each one of these technologies that we've been talking about. So I just want to reiterate that, and thank you for Rebecca and others who have helped me sort of put this together. So that is there. And then, go ahead, question?
Mike DeVasto.
Yeah, just quickly, I can let Scott finish and then.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Michael. I thought I did say that was the last slide, didn't I? But there's actually a couple more. I apologize. So Ryan asked me to include some specifics here, and again, we don't have time to go through these, but I want to show. I've actually, if you remember if I go back to this one just for a second, this looks at the 6 phases with all the technologies and estimated nitrogen reductions. To Ryan's excellent point at the beginning of the meeting, this does not break it down by sub-watershed. This is overall. But I have done a scenario, I've done 6 scenarios, which I'll just flip through here and tell you what they are, that do show each one of these elements for each sub-watershed. So you can see Herring Creek, Duck Creek, et cetera, and the numbers. And so this is, and the 6 scenarios, I'll just flip through them, this one is with INAs performing at 5 milligrams per liter to the 30-year period of 2052. Here's the INAs at 5 milligrams at build out. And I should mention one of the key things that these calculators produce, because this is a good question that Brian Dudley asked me early on, and that is, are there enough systems in each sub-watershed that could be upgraded to meet the target? And that's exactly why I did this. So these percentage numbers show you the percentage of systems that would need to be upgraded within each watershed to meet the targets, along with these other strategies that I've already identified, and assuming this level of performance, this one being the best level of performance, 5 milligrams. I've also done analysis for INAs at 8 milligrams per liter for 2052, 8 milligrams per liter for build out scenario. And you can see these percentages go up because as the systems perform less efficiently, you need more of them. That's sort of the bottom line here. And then as I go into the last set, 3A and 3B, this is with the system performing at 11 milligrams per liter at 2052. And then the last scenario, and I've got some highlights on here that I just want to speak to for 1 minute, under 3B at 11 milligrams under build out condition, there are certain sub-watersheds where we're just barely making it, as where you'd need essentially all of the systems converted, which may be considered unreasonable. So I would say under this scenario, under the 11 milligram, it would probably make a lot more sense to consider either some so-called cluster systems and or certainly the downtown sewer or even expanded sewers as an alternative to this, obviously depending on costs and other factors. So what this analysis suggests is at the 11 milligram per liter performance, and that there would be the requirement for other technologies. I do also discuss in the report some growth management possibilities, because you'll notice that this problem of reaching close to 100% is only in certain sub-watersheds. So there is a possibility of doing things like transfer development rights or other growth management strategies to try to rebalance, if you will, the situation. But that's a discussion for another time. But anyways, these are available. And I was talking with Ryan today, recognizing that we don't have time to go through these, but I do want to offer, and I mean this sincerely, I will sit down with anybody and go through these spreadsheets and explain in as much detail as you want the assumptions I'm making, how I'm doing the calculations. I want this to be a very transparent process. I have gone through this with Brian Dudley the day I gave him the Hank Finkel card. We sat down and went through this, and I provided some updates, and I've offered to go through it with him and his assistant Drew again, and hopefully we'll have time to do that before Mr. Dudley departs us. But I'd sit down with anybody in the town as well, just because I want this to be very transparent. So I'll leave it at that, Ryan. I think that literally is the last. I'm not even going to explain that one. So let me leave it at that. And I guess, Michael, you had a question?
I just wanted to make a comment about process going forward and what I'd kind of like to see, I think, as far as community outreach and, policy directives from the select board and the community prior to making an application for a watershed permit. And I would hope that we could have potentially utilize a community forum once we get close to application process. I'd like to see some better data on the central district touring costs and benefits, such as possibly increased capacity for commercial properties, housing, possible benefits for doing that sort of thing, so that the public and the board can weigh, apples to apples. Yes, it might be cheaper, but what do we get from this? Also, I don't know if I even want to bring up the letters PCBs, and if there's something coming down the pipe where we may have to deal with that like other towns are, and I don't know how enhanced INAs deal with that. And that's kind of like throwing a wrench into the, we don't have to deal with that in this process, but it may be something we want to think about. I don't know if the town's tested or whatever, but they have had problems in Chatham. And so, and then I'd like to see it come to the select board for comments about the actual policies and process before we submit a watershed permit application. So, and obviously it would have to go to town meeting. I don't know if it goes to town meeting before we get the watershed permit or after. I don't know that at that point. It depends on if there's expenditures or if we just want to ask the town if they approve it before we submit it. And that's kind of I guess we'd have to figure that out through whether there's spending involved initially that we need to do, but I'm kind of apprehensive about dropping more funding into the plan until we seem to be pretty close to having this watershed permit so that we can say, hey, look, this is the project, this is the entirety of the project, and this is where we as a town want to go, and get the watershed permit, and then tell everyone, look, this is our permit, this is what we have to do, this is what it's going to take to do it. So that's kind of how I see the process going forward. And you know, whatever, it's up to comments, and people who have gone through this already may have a better idea.
There's only one other that has gone through it so far. But Brian Baumgarten.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one more thing, not to belabor the meeting, but with respect to the PFCs, it's actually perfluorinated compounds. We are actually in the process of working with EPA ORD in Cincinnati to do testing on contaminants of emerging concern, specifically from these wood chip systems, to see what their efficacy is in removing contaminants of emerging concern, including things like PFOS, PFOA, 1,4-dioxane, and a whole host of other compounds related to pharmaceuticals. So that information hopefully will be available within the next few months as we do the sampling for that, and we can provide that information to you.
Brian, if I may just add Chris Gobler's work on that as well. He just presented that on Long Island, and I can provide that, Michael, to you and the town, because there is some test data on Long Island that looks quite good for these systems on that subject matter.
Okay. So this is a question for the select board. Do we want to try to set a deadline of some sort, or what are our expectations as to when to reasonably expect a draft prepared for submittal?
I think it would be a good idea.
Okay, Helen?
Yeah, through you to Scott. What's a reasonable timeline?
Well, Helen, thank you. As I said, I have a rough draft internal that I think I can make available within the next week or so. I just need to go through the comments. I think then we need to have some discussion. I also think though, I would invite, and I think it's there, more discussion with DEP to go through some of the details. I think I can make those revisions from maybe some discussions with the town and with Brian. I think I can do that within the 3-month time frame that Anastasia mentioned. And then at that point, I would invite, and she and I have had a number of conversations already. My intention would be her and I to work together to integrate her work into the plan and then produce sort of a joint document. I would guess that would take on the order of maybe 1 or 2 months after she completes her work. So I guess that would add up to something like 6 months from now would be reasonable. If we did 3 months, and just for Anastasia's benefit, she is not under contract yet. And so her 3 months, I think, starts from whenever she gets authorized.
Mike?
Yeah, I was just, I think Scott answered the question. Actually, I can just lower my hand. I think I would hope that we could submit sometime in the spring, but I don't know if that's realistic.
Okay, Tim. Pascarnis. So.
Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the 208 consistency guidance, I'll just mention as we're talking about sort of timelines and tasks that the select board and whatever other bodies might be involved in the review of the draft targeted watershed management plan would be undertaking. So one element which we've brought up with Scott that hasn't really been addressed in it so far is what the town's financing plan is going to be for the proposed strategies that are in the plan, and in terms of not just identifying potential funding sources, but looking at what the impacts of funding these projects are going to be on the community, on the taxpayers, whether there are any sort of equity considerations. And so all of these sorts of things kind of have, may ripple out into other areas of discussion that have come up tonight, perhaps how exactly what the management entity structure is going to be if IAs are employed, how, if a sewer system or some sort of town, utility type of framework were used, how, who would pay into that. And, again, these are all complicated things with a lot of details that have been brought up in passing tonight. And so I just wanted to identify that that's a specific area of 208 consistency review as well. And so something to keep in mind as the various committees are looking at the draft plan and working out the details of it.
Yeah, the financing was kind of planned to be discussed tonight, but we're obviously not going to get there tonight. Helen?
Yeah, so the select board can request in a directive fashion that both the Board of Health and the Clean Water Committee, Advisory Committee, express this a bit. And we can do this. We can say, this needs your particular attention. You may need to meet more often. You need to be sure you get quorums, and we need to hear back from you. The town needs to hear back from you. Select board can do that. We can't tell them how to vote. We can't tell them what to discuss in terms of, let's say, those regulations that have been proposed to the Board of Health. We can't tell them what to vote on that. But we can do that formally at our next meeting if you want to put it on the agenda. Thank you.
Okay, so the Clean Water Committee has not met since June.
What? Oh, excuse me.
So, Mike?
Yeah, I was just going to request another meeting with the committee and the select board to just particularly discuss financing. 'Cause I don't think that's a Board of Health issue.
Yeah. So I'd like to make a motion on expectation of the direct draft, I guess. I move that Clean Water Advisory Committee be, Helen, would it be, we can instruct, you said advised, so advised that the select board expects a draft watershed submittal no later than May 2nd, 2022. Helen, you're muted. So Helen?
Ryan,
Yep.
I think given what Scott Horsley said, that giving them a deadline isn't a good idea, but being directive to them and requesting them to work on it with a full quorum or as full as they can get, not just individual members, in the coming seasons, winter and spring, we can do that. It's a directive. Okay, and also to request the Board of Health to please work on this. We can request an advisory committee can, having been on one and had the then select board tell us we had to revise the shellfish regs, we can be more directive. A regulatory board is more independent. But a request from us, they can ignore it, but we make it clear what the needs are. And it's sort of a horizontal, pressure.
So that deadline is like 8 months from now, I believe.
I just think deadlines aren't a good idea.
I think we need to start setting expectations at this point. The final MEP report was delivered in 2017. The wastewater committee has been working on this for over a decade. At this point, we need to start setting expectations and be ready to submit. So, Mike?
I think I would like to just leave this deadline out until we can meet with them in the reasonably short future and discuss the financing segment of it. And I would like to see, us be ready by spring, but I want to be realistic and I want to make sure what we submit to both the public and to the DPH is comprehensive and has been well vetted. So I think it's within our authority to direct any committee to actually direct committees to work on something or give a deadline. I don't think right now setting an absolute deadline. It may be sooner, it may be later. I don't feel that comfortable with setting a deadline at this moment.
Okay,
While we
well,
digest it.
that's why I said draft submittal. It is not the final. It wouldn't be the final submittal. It would be, a draft submittal.
Mr. Chair, through
Yep.
you. Scott, is that a reasonable timeline or what are we looking at here?
I think it is. Like I said, and again, Anastasia, please speak up if we're going to work jointly on this. I think if you get your work done in 3 months and we give ourselves another month or two to put the two plans together, I think the May date sounds fine with me. There are some unknowns. I'm glad Tim brought up the financing part of this because we've only had preliminary discussions about that. I like Michael DeVasto's idea to have a session on that, to talk detail about what the options are and what the preferences are in the part of the town. So that's probably the only unknown part of it to me. The financing part is what we need to do specifically and how long it will take to get there and get concurrence with the town on what directions they want to go. But I think overall that timeframe I'm comfortable with.
And Scott, I would agree with you on the timeline.
Thank you, Anastasia.
Okay. Well, given that, I'd be comfortable voting on it.
Okay, Helen?
Do you want to give me a motion to, tell me what the motion is, please?
I made a motion, so I move that the Clean Water Advisory Committee be advised that the Select Board expects a draft watershed submittal no later than May, what did I say?
Second.
May 2nd, 2022.
Not expect, requires. If you're
Okay,
gonna do it, say requires.
okay, requires draft submittal no later than May 2nd, 2022.
Second.
Okay, can I have a roll call vote, please?
Michael, I.
John, I.
Ryan, I.
Helen, I.
Okay, motion carries 4-0.
And I'd like to also suggest that the Select Board make it clear that we're willing to spend the time and energy on this subject as well during that time period.
Yep, there's obviously a lot more ground that we need to cover. But I think we're at the end of our endurance.
Okay, motion to adjourn.
So
Oh, we have something
1
else.
second. Is there still a quorum of the Board of Health here?
Yes.
Okay, so you're gonna have, the Board of Health is gonna have to adjourn as well. I don't believe that there's a quorum of the wastewater committee or the Clean Water Advisory Committee anymore. Would the Board of Health want to go first? So, Janet, I think that would be a little cleaner. You're muted.
I'm unmuted now. We can make this a top priority for us. Absolutely. We've been a bit busy with COVID. However, we can certainly make this a top priority. I just in closing, the message that's going to come with a regulation or without a regulation is going to be the first message that our public is really hearing about a wastewater plan. So I'm just going to close with that. I can't speak for the entire committee. But if anybody that's on here, that's making up the quorum disagrees with me. But we certainly can make that our priority and working on this and thinking it through and taking all that was said tonight into our consciousness and our decision-making. And that's what I can say. So I agree with your dates, et cetera.
Okay, yeah, I believe that we'll have to have, I mean, there has to be a robust public engagement process. much more
Absolutely, and
robust
there has been none. So I know just hearing from the four select people that are here tonight, that we will have your support in that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I guess for the select board, I move to adjourn.
Helen, second.
Okay, roll call vote, please.
John, aye.
Michael, I.
Ryan, I.
Helen, I.
Okay. And then the
Thank
Board of
you.
Health.
Thank you, people from the outside. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and extend our thanks to everybody who attended, and I mean, it was extremely helpful.
And thank you, Hillary.
It looks like we did lose Debbie Freeman just about a minute ago, so we won't be able to formally adjourn.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yep. All right. Well, good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good night.